IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It's Thursday, May 25th. That dude right there, some of you will recognize, some of you may not. That's my guy, Tim O'Malley of Irish Illustrated. And Tim is joining us today because we're going to talk some Notre Dame football. On Tuesday, we had Bill Bender of Sporting News here to talk about what the expectations are for Notre Dame in 2023 from an outsider standpoint. As someone who I think is very fair to Notre Dame, very fair to Northern teams, is not someone who says everyone in the SEC is great and everyone that's not in the SEC sucks. He is not one of those guys. Neither is that guy, Tim O'Malley. So we're going to talk Notre Dame football 2023 expectations. And Tim, this is obviously our first time having you on, man. So I'm very excited, and I want to thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate it. Long time coming. We tried a couple
times.
But
that's right. There's always something, right? There's some kid that you've got to take to this practice or that game, or
you hit my wheelhouse right here. 1 o'clock on Thursdays, though. That's the wheelhouse. We'll be good.
That's right. That's right. So Tim, you and I were chatting the other day, and we were kind of talking about this 2023 football team and kind of the excitement that there is around this team, but also that there's so many questions about this team and the range of where this team could be from, if Marcus Freeman's not the guy we think he is, or if this happens or that happens, boy, this team could be here. But if this goes well, if that goes well, this team could be here. And I think that's the really intriguing aspect about this 2023 team is there's a lot of potential, but also a lot of questions. And I think the first question to address is we really still don't know who Marcus Freeman is. And so when you look at this 23 season, Tim, how much do you think we can learn about Marcus Freeman as a head coach and the direction of this program based on this season alone?
A lot more than year one, because one thing we kind of talked about offline and I wrote about in the past was there's not a chance, as much as everybody liked Marcus Freeman and the hiring of Freeman and what he was doing to work on the recruiting trail, that he could be as good of a coach in year one as he was going to be in year 5. There's no such thing as a football coach that's that. And you brought up previously here, year 2 is the same thing. He's going to keep getting better as a coach, but you get a more fair assessment in year 2. There's always culture changes you have to have behind the scenes. People don't know about them. Sometimes they're giant, obvious issues. Sometimes they're just cultural things you have to change. I think Marcus Freeman, the way he handled the team after the Marshall loss and after the Stanford loss especially, because the Marshall loss was just an absolute shock to the system. After the Stanford loss especially, that they were able to regroup, play their best football for a while, would have played better football at USC. I'm not saying they would have beaten USC with the 2 corners involved in the game, but they would have played better against USC. I thought he handled the football team very well after the Stanford loss. I thought he handled the job well after the Marshall loss is the best way to say it. Maybe the football team obviously still had some growing to do, but I thought he handled his job well. And then the football team, and we've talked about this a lot, the Stanford loss was probably worse.
Oh, yeah. As far as the quality of the football team, the perception might not be worse.
No, the perception is definitely not worse.
But. Yeah, because, what was it? Where were they last? I always forget. Conference USA last year, they've jumped around, but Vince and I actually had this argument last summer. Vince was like, the worst team on the schedule. It's like, bro, no, they're not. Trust me. It's a good football team. And so they lost to a better team. The circumstance was more understandable, because it was after Ohio State. That's why it was one of our summer trap games when we looked at the schedule. But still no excuse for it, right? I mean, Notre Dame should never lose to Marshall, ever. I don't care what your circumstances are. It just was more of I could see that one coming. Stanford hadn't lost to a Power 5. I mean, forget Power 5. They hadn't lost to an FBS team in over a calendar year. The only win they had in that stretch of time was over Colgate, and you lost to them at home. And it was talk about shock to the system. I mean, it was you flatlined. Really as a program, you flatline, because the one big question that arose at that time is these are the games that Brian Kelly never lost in his last 5 years. These are the games that you knew that they were going to win those games. How is Freeman going to respond to it? And I thought, like you said, Tim, he responded incredibly well. And I also kind of liked, some people didn't like this. I'm a big fan of humility. I'm a big fan of honesty. And I think sometimes you could say, if you're going to have a criticism of Marcus Freeman, he's maybe too honest about things. You kind of want him to act like he's got all the answers, but he didn't early in the season.
Right.
And I actually appreciated that. And I think over time, the players began to appreciate that, because it was still very much hey, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. And it wasn't done in a way that we saw under the previous regime, where it's like he would take the blame while sort of not taking the blame. Like, it's like, well, I didn't do this, but then all of a sudden you can feel the shade being thrown at the players or somebody else, right? I thought he took that ownership, and I think the team eventually responded to it. And then there's a lot of things that you and I know about that he did behind the scenes after Stanford that got this team going that have continued with certain guys maybe not coming back, some coaching changes. And when I mean coaching changes, I don't mean that he got rid of people that were problems. It was more of when people left, what he focused on to replace them with is what I'm referring to. And so at least in that regard, I feel like we saw a lot of growth from Marcus Freeman. He'll never be to build on what you said, Tim, he'll never be the same coach in year 2 that he'll be in year 5.
Right.
However, I do think that this year, Tim, more than any really other, we're going to learn this season about Marcus Freeman and his staff, Jared Parker, Al Golden, Gino Gaduli, Joe Rua, all the way down the line. We're going to learn if this staff has the chops or not. Doesn't mean they have to be perfect. It doesn't have to mean he's acts like a 10-year vet in year 2, but you're going to see things this year that show us he's got the chops or he's got a lot longer way to go than I thought.
I think you're going to learn it between September 23 with Ohio State leading into USC, because if you're going to identify trap games, I mean, you break down the schedule, everybody says the 3. There's the 3 games we all know about. There's the 3 you cannot lose, quote unquote. You're not allowed to lose 3 of those games as well. And then there's the 3 ACC road games, 2 back-to-back that are sandwiched by USC and Ohio State. I'm not even counting learning about the coaching staff for the USC game. You might win the game, you might lose the game, but I know how the coaching staff is going to handle that game. How do you handle the incredible high after beating to Ohio State, or the incredible deflation of losing to Ohio State against 2 teams that you should beat but are capable of beating Notre Dame? That's the issue. And those spreads
8-9 win teams last year.
Exactly. Yeah. And those spreads are going to be 7, 8.5 points. You can lose those games. You shouldn't lose those games, but you play them back to back in between your 2 toughest games of the season. I know Notre Dame is going to respond to the USC game at night. I know they will be ready for the USC game at night. That is not a coaching staff test. That is a program test, a player test to see if you can beat USC and Caleb Williams. Duke and Louisville after Ohio State. That's, I think, where you see a growth from year 1 to year 2 in a coaching staff.
Because when you look at a team that's a good team, a team that's got some maturity, you don't lose 16 to 14 games to Stanford at home. And I don't expect this team to be that. What you can lose, however, are to teams that have good quarterback play or offenses that can score. And that's the concern for me with Duke and Louisville is in the past, Duke had some really good defenses. I mean, the team that Notre Dame played in 2019 on the road, that was a really good defensive football team at Duke. They didn't look that good that night against Notre Dame. But you had 2 good ends. They had quality defensive players. We talk about the 2016 team that beat Notre Dame. What was the recipe for that team that year? Now, of course, Notre Dame was a train wreck, but we didn't know how much of a train wreck Notre Dame was going to be just yet. But they had a quarterback that can make plays, and they had legit athletes on defense. But a well-coached Notre Dame team doesn't lose that game.
And they had a backup kick returner that could score touchdowns, which is kind of amazing too. That was
the teams that can upset you normally, if you're a good team, are teams that can score. You look around the years when Alabama lost games in the SEC. It wasn't very often they lost a 12-10 game. It was always they lost some shootout, right? I think other than like a 26-12 loss to Auburn, usually it's like Ole Miss beating them in a high-scoring game. You know, Johnny Manziel doing some Superman stuff against them in 2012. And that's the thing about those games, Tim, is they have a quarterback at Duke that can hurt you with his arm and his legs. They have legit weapons at wide receiver. And that's the concern there on top of the emotional stuff. And then Louisville is a coach that you're familiar with in Jeff Brom, but he's going to have a lot of athletes and probably the most talented defense he's ever had as a head coach just because of what he inherits at Louisville. Offensive guy, be able to score. There'll be 6 or 7 games into his tenure there. That's what makes them concerning. And to your point, a mentally focused and prepared Notre Dame team goes 2-0 against those 2 teams. And that's what we're going to learn is how quickly can Marcus Freeman get those teams ready, because this is, to your point, Tim, this is round 2 of Marshall. That's what these games are. Because they're not that different than from what Marshall was last year. I think they're both better quarterback than what Marshall was, but Marshall had some legitimate athletes.
Yes, but Marshall had better corners. Marshall had
better corners, pretty good wideouts.
Yeah, good running back.
Former 5-star running back, legit power, like lower power 5 level offensive line. It was a really good offensive line. and Notre Dame couldn't take advantage of the areas where they should have been much better, like, post route wide open by 7 yards and you can't hit it, right? But it was all the stuff against Marshall was all up here, Tim. It was you weren't mentally ready and physically ready to. You weren't physically ready because you weren't mentally ready to play that game because they couldn't get that team ready to play. He did a better job than after the Stanford loss, but it also helped that you were playing UNLV. This isn't UNLV, right? These are good football teams, but that's what we're going to learn about Coach Freeman. It's can you get the team mentally ready to play against the best teams? And I'll say this about Notre Dame last year. There was never a doubt in my mind. Ohio State game, they got outplayed and outcoached in some regards. But that team was mentally and physically ready to play. They were up for that game. Sure. They just didn't execute all that well, which, game one, new coach, whatever, you can excuse it. They were ready to play North Carolina. They were mentally, emotionally ready to play Carolina. They were mentally and emotionally ready to play BYU. They were mentally and emotionally ready to play Clemson, and the same thing for USC. So the games that at the beginning of the season, we looked at the best teams on the schedule, they were mentally and emotionally ready to play those games, and they played well. Even, I shouldn't say play well, they played hard, even in games they lost. The problem was they weren't mentally ready to play Marshall, Stanford. To a degree, I would say UNLV. They just out-talented UNLV. At least the defense was ready to play that game. I don't know if the offense
the
was ready
special
to play
team
that game.
caused. Isaiah Foskey blocked 2 punts, or Collie got 1, but that is those matter.
Those were because we're just better than you, type of things. They weren't. I don't know that Navy. You kind of let your guard down after getting a big halftime lead. Those are the type of things where you saw at times a lack of maturity as a football team, because it's easy to get up for the big games. And because you didn't have a coach that was tamping down that emotion and energy. That's the difference. So I like that. But can you get them mentally and emotionally ready to play? Because here's the thing that gets overlooked, Tim, in my opinion. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Sometimes people dismiss the Tennessee States and the Central Michigan games as not important. And I don't agree, because I think those are the games where you really prove yourself as a coach to make sure that you don't lose your momentum, if you have any, when things are going well. Like, hey, if you take this team lightly, and that's why Lou Holtz was the way he was. That's why he was miserable to be around during those weeks, because it was, these kids aren't idiots. They're going to pop into film and realize this team sucks. So it's up to me to make sure that the way that I conduct myself and we as coaches conduct ourselves, that we keep the edge this week, because the opponent film is not going to do it. And that's something that we're going to learn about this staff as well, Tim. And you need to be that way, to me, to be a championship caliber program.
And I think Central is will be an indication of that, because it's after a road game at NC State that you'll be up for, and it's before your biggest game. And the crowd is not going to help Notre Dame for the Central Michigan game. It's going to be a beautiful day in South Bend, one of the last 2 beautiful days to watch a game, one of the last 3 beautiful days to watch a game on Saturday in South Bend. Central will have its fans there. It's going to have that Boston College Toledo feel of, why is it 10-3 in the middle of the second quarter? That type of, if you run into that, can they put it on them in the second half? Because human nature is going to come into play in one of these games, in the Tennessee State or Central Michigan game. It shouldn't. Tennessee State, the real value of, the real difficult part of Tennessee State is you're traveling back from Ireland and you have to go play football. Right. That's really the only problem there, which is why it was scheduled there. I'd be worried more about Central Michigan if that was in that spot, if you flip-flop those 2 games. I think they'll be back and in the swing of things, but I could see the Central Michigan game being disappointing for a while. How do you respond in the second half? It will be a great sign if they come out and absolutely bulldoze Central Michigan with Ohio State on tap. I don't know. I expect it. When I say Ball State, I don't expect Ball State, Toledo have to win the game at the end. But I just mean the atmosphere, the feeling of, should you kill this team, or why aren't you killing this team?
But that is part of what we're talking about here. Is how that game goes is going to tell us a lot about the maturity of this team. And the maturity of a football team is part about your leadership and your locker room. But that's built by your coaches, and they have to set that agenda. I still remember the great story about Coach Holtz, and when he first gets hired, he walks in, he's, get your feet off, take your hat off, sit up straight. There's a culture involved here that is established by the head football coach. Same players that he had before. Yeah. It's just, but the culture is different. The expectations are different. How we go about doing our business on a daily basis is going to be different. And I think those are the type of things that you look at a game like that and say, okay, there's 3 scenarios, right, that I think are plausible. Them losing is not one that I look at. Central Michigan's not that kind of team.
I
This
don't
isn't.
think so either, and I didn't mean to
Yeah.
compare Toledo. They actually could not block Toledo.
Well,
That has
Toledo
nothing
wasn't
to
that
do
good
with the
either.
Central Michigan
I
game.
mean,
Yeah, that's
Toledo wasn't that good either. That
yeah,
team wasn't. Notre Dame team wasn't very good. That was
right.
one of the worst 11-1 teams I've ever seen. If
Especially
we're being
at that
honest
point of the
about it.
season, they were
Yes.
really having trouble.
But you look at the Central Michigan game, and option number 1 is they come out early and they just put it to Central Michigan, which is like, okay, this is a focused, locked-on football team. That tells me there's a lot of growth that's happened. Number 2 is they come out and maybe struggle a little bit in the first quarter and then put them away late.
Yeah,
Sort
yeah.
of like UMass in 2015.
It's kind of how I look at the game if I had to right now would be that scenario.
Yeah, where it's like it's kind of close, but you kind of started to see that Notre Dame team pull away in the second quarter, and then they just buried them in the third and fourth quarter. And then obviously number 3 is it's like Toledo, where again I don't see it being that competitive because I don't think they have the athletes at quarterback and receiver and in the second. I mean, Toledo had some good athletes. They weren't a very good football team because they weren't very good in the trenches. Notre Dame could just beat them in the trenches when at least they should have. They did
I was
defensively.
gonna say, I don't. Notre Dame had trouble blocking because they weren't a very good football team.
Because they stunk.
Yeah.
If they'd have played them in November, I think that looks a little bit different. But they had the advantage in the trenches, and there was enough plays in there where they could sort of just exert their will and win that game. But that's the other alternative is it's just an ugly, scrappy, competitive 4-quarter game. That's also going to tell us a lot. But that's sort of the gauge that you look at because Tennessee State's different because you're coming back from it. There's going to be the energy of a first home game.
Yeah.
There's going to be the excitement of the environment, the HBCU angle. Eddie George is on the other sideline. I think in Tennessee State's just not good. They're not a good FCS football team. And so I don't know if that's going to tell us as much, but I think that Central Michigan game, also being game 4, is a good gauge to tell us where they are. And then, of course, can you maintain your ability to be ready for those games? This team's going to face adversity, Tim, even whether it's wins or losses. And I think to me, last year at times, this team did not handle adversity well in some areas, and in other areas they did. This year, you want to see them be more consistent with it. And I think that's another area where we're going to learn a lot about this head football coach because you barring injury, you're going to be more experienced in the areas where you need to be more experienced than you were last year. Tackle, quarterback, on the perimeter, middle linebacker. I mean, you're even more experienced than you were last year. And then now you're not learning a new system on defense as well. So I think those are the areas where we're going to learn a lot about who Marcus Freeman is and his ability to build this football team. And then their ability to counterpunch because you always go into every season thinking this is going to be our strength. And we hear it all the time, Tim. We talk to ourselves, we're going to be really good at this.
Oh, yeah.
Then you get the season, you're like, yeah, we're not as good as we thought we're going to be. Can you adjust? Can you adapt? And I thought that's something that I thought Notre Dame did a pretty good job of last year is they realized pretty quickly, like the Stanford game was sort of the eye-opening experience that, hey, we just can't do this. First 2 games with Drew Pine at quarterback, they didn't have any film of what we're going to do. They didn't know who we're going to, but teams quickly figured it out. And can we adjust defensively, special teams wise, and offensively to say, hey, we thought we were going to be this. We don't have that guy at quarterback anymore. We now have to go here. Can you adjust on the fly? It took them a little long to figure that out last year, in my opinion. And I think they got, I think sometimes early success can mask who you really are.
I was going to say, I think it took him a while because Drew Pine did have a great game in game number 2, a good game in game number 3, and a bounce back from an all-time awful half in game number 1. I'm sure they had a misconception of what they were because you saw what Drew Pine at his best would be. He wasn't always going to be at his best. They weren't going to always be at their best alongside him.
Right. And I think that was sort of, they didn't think enough about that guy that we saw in the first half is, and even at times in the second half. And that's the thing, you break those, especially that second game against Carolina down. He played a great game, but it was also, your game plan was outstanding.
Yeah.
I felt it's one of the best games Tom Reese has ever called. And then you'd see they kind of went away from that and didn't show the same faith. And I think part of it was because you did have those moments where just the quarterback just wasn't quite ready to play, but then teams adjust and you had no counter punches. That's not going to be an excuse this year unless there's an injury, in my opinion. So you can't use that anymore. And of course, last year's came because of an injury as well. So we kind of talked a little bit with Tim about what we're going to learn. Let's talk about get specifically this 2023 team. When you look at this team, obviously last year 8-4 regular season. I don't think that was the floor of that team. I think the floor of that team was probably another loss or two. Once the injuries happened, another loss or two.
Once Tyler Buckner went down. Oh, I agree completely. Once Tyler Buckner was injured and they were 0-2, 8-4 was not the floor. Now, I think it was the floor. It was probably the floor talking right now. If you go back in time and say, well, because I really thought you can never plan for a season-ending injury to your quarterback. I really thought if Tyler Buckner got hurt, Drew Pine would come in and rally the team for one win, and then Tyler Buckner would come back. Of course, then he's lost for 10 games. It's not the same thing. But no, I think I probably in our podcast and Irish Illustrated, when they were 0-2, nobody was predicting. I think Priester might have said 8-4, but I think it was probably 7-5. At some point, he went to 8-4, and we're all like, it's still not going to be 8-4. But it ended up being 8-4. So you're right. Once the injury happened, I mean, the floor was 6-6 when they're 0-2. Yeah. That's the only way of looking at it.
You're just hoping you get to a bowl game, and then you're struggling against Cal for weren't they? It was 10-7 at halftime. They were down, correct? Or were they up 10-7?
Were playing terribly. They were averaging 2.1 yards per play on first down. They couldn't. I mean, they had 4 3-and-outs. They had a fumble to go along with 4 3-and-outs. They had dropped passes. They had a missed pass for Michael Mayer. And look, they came back and played well and won the game. Two.
The seam route and the one he threw into the ground.
They also dropped a Hail Mary. Let's be fair. There was a Hail Mary. I know that would have been a miracle tie, and they would have gone for 2, which would have been the most exciting and angst-ridden 2-point conversion in Notre Dame history when you're 0-2 and Cal's going for 2 in the win. So that was a bit fortunate, but then this became a better football team, save for that one loss in the middle.
So what's the floor right now of what we know? And people say, well, what if this guy gets hurt? We can't. We're not mind readers.
Sam Hartman misses one game. We say Sam Hartman misses one game because guys miss one game. That's right. I mean, Ian Book missed one game, right?
Probably winning most of those games unless that one game is Ohio State, Clemson, whatever.
It would be
bad
when
you look at this team, Tim, not what the floor could be if things don't go well, but what the floor should be for this team when you combine where Notre Dame is weak and strong, the opposition, because the schedule has to be taken into account.
Oh, that's all I'm taking. I'm taking that.
I've said this. I think I said this to you when we were having lunch the other day. I was far more impressed by the 9-3 2017 season than I was the 10-2 19 or the 11-1 2021 season, because of the quality of the teams that they had to play and beat to get to that 9-3.
And how they beat some of them. They hammered them, some of them.
The 2011 team is barely 500. The 2021 team is barely 500 against the 2017 schedule. I mean, that's just how I feel about it, the way that team played. So what is the realistic floor for this football team?
Well, so with the 3 main games and with the 3 ACC roads, and then I throw in Pitt because it's in not a great spot of the schedule either. And then I have 5 you can't really lose. So you do start 5-0. When I say you can't really lose, it's kind of sad to say that because they lost to one of them last year. But I don't think that's going to be the situation with Stanford. I still think the floor is 8-4 because you can go 1-2 in your 3 big games, and you could go, if you're playing very poorly, 2-2 in your 4 other ACC games, including Pitt. That is the floor, though. I do not expect that to happen. You could also go 0-3, playing well in your 3 big games, and drop one other game of those ACC games along the way.
So we look at floor a little differently. You look at floor as what could happen, and I don't disagree. When I look at floor, what I'm referring to is more of what should the floor be? What is the floor of what is a reasonable expectation of what this team should be? I think to your point,
9-3 is the reasonable floor expectation, but I still think people will be disappointed.
Oh yeah, and should be in my opinion.
Yes.
I think 8-4 to me is it goes back to the last discussion we had. You can't say it's not possible, based on what we saw last year, and you can say, well, they did A, B, C, and D. The whole point when you have a first-year starter quarterback or a first-year head coach or a second-year head coach or a guy that's early in his tenure somewhere is you may think that they're going to do this or respond this way, but you don't really know. You're projecting. Well, the second half of the season, they won 6-7. Okay, sure. But it's still the same season. You know, there weren't a lot of teams in the second half of the season after Stanford that you say, well, other than Clemson, well, yeah, you should have beat that team. It would have been Syracuse was probably the closest to a quality team, but I mean, they we saw what happened to them after the
quarterback
Clemson
was hurt as well too.
Right, and so they weren't the same team. And they weren't that good of a team either. And when you're building your resume off of beating Syracuse as your second best win, you just answered my question about how good the schedule was in the second half. And it did great against Clemson, obviously. Had a great game. But that's my thing is we have to learn about Marcus Freeman to say that. When I look at floor, so I'm not pushing back on what you said. I'm saying I'm looking at it differently. To me, my floor is 10-2. And the reason I say that is because you either have to do one of two things, in my view. You either have to go 2-1 against the best teams on your schedule, and then you have room for a wow, that was a rough loss. Like you point to Duke, for example, right? Let's say they beat Ohio State, and they don't handle that success well, and Riley Leonard goes off the next week. Mike Elko gets that defense ready to force some turnovers, and you drop one. And then you rally back. Either you beat USC and then lose to Clemson, or lose to USC and beat Clemson. One of those two things happens. That's to me. Or you beat the teams you're supposed to beat along the way, and then you go 1-2 against the big three. I would not be happy with 9-3, because 9-3 to me is basically a repeat of last year.
I agree.
You're just better at quarterback, right? So what you're telling me is, not you, generally speaking, is you're telling me Sam Hartman's only one game better than Drew Pine and Tyler Buckner. Now, the schedule's tough. Yeah, it's not that much tougher than last year. And your big three, you get at home 2 of those games, where last year 2 of the 3 on the road. And the other factor in is 2 of those teams are replacing quarterbacks.
Yes, and
this year, the
Ohio State situation was much harder going into the season, the game to win, opening with Tyler Buckner's first start at Ohio State and CJ Stroud, than any situation is this season at all for Notre Dame. Like that,
agree.
They played hard. As you said, they didn't play well. They played hard, but no Notre Dame fan came away from that thinking this is going to be a rough year when they didn't beat Ohio State.
No, you thought, boy, this team's gonna be
legit too.
Yeah, and Harry Heastand's going to get the O-line going, and you had some missed opportunities, and if this thing goes right, that thing goes right. Boy, man, we kept CJ Stroud in check. We're going to be pretty good on defense.
Yeah. Now they don't have that. They don't have that situation where you're like, how in the world are they going to win that game? That is not a situation this year, because the only time you're going to be a real underdog is Ohio State, and that's at home, and you shouldn't be a giant underdog. I was surprised that opened at 7 points. I get it because it's the offseason. But I wasn't surprised when the Ohio State spread opened at 14.5 last year. Let's put it that way, because that could have happened. And look, Notre Dame played great, and it almost didn't play great. Notre Dame played hard, and it almost happened. Because
you had a missed field goal.
Yeah,
you had Ohio State had a drive late in the game that they could have punched one in the end zone if they wanted to. Yes, agree with that. I think the thing about this year's schedule, I think you nailed it. There is no Ohio State 2022 on this year's schedule. I mean, that Ohio State team again got embarrassed by Michigan, but that team also took Georgia down to the wire, and they're a play here, a play there, a missed field goal, a Marvin Harrison not going down, run game just giving you 3 extra yards, whatever. They were close. They gave Georgia fits. They outplayed Georgia for much of that game. I felt, at least that's how I felt.
National champion, because they would have won the next game too. That's how you have to understand.
Although I think that next game would have been more competitive, because I think TCU was a much better matchup for Georgia.
Yeah,
for Ohio State than they were for Georgia. That's just it would have been.
Admittedly, my 8 and floor is a floor bottoming out. No one is happy situation.
I think it's a very fair way of looking at it, Tim. I mean, there's 2 types of ways. You don't have to justify it. I think there's just looking at it differently when you define floor. You're trying to look at it because you've been covering Notre Dame for how long?
Yeah, 16 years. So yeah.
Okay, we've seen a lot of that. We've seen a lot of. There's no way this team is worse than 10-2, turn into 8-5.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
You just mentioned half the years it happened to you.
That's right. So I get it. I just think it's more of just how you define floor. So I don't have a problem with what you said, and that's not a part of why I didn't give you a ton of direction, because I wanted to see where you would go with that. Because I think it's fair, Tim, to look and say, I would be disappointed with 8-4, but I can't sit here and tell you that you're nuts for thinking that might happen. I would just define floor differently, in my view.
Pittsburgh is one I also think we're going to overlook when the time comes, no matter what's going on with the Panthers and Notre Dame. And it's always just a bit of a problem when you're playing Narduzzi and the pre-Clemson situation. It's post-bye. It's not post-USC. It's post-bye.
Mm-hmm.
Remember I say you have to generate your own You got to bring your own guts, as Dabo Sweeney said. That is bring your own, because they're bringing it, and it is nothing compared to your game before and after it in your mind.
Yeah.
Notre Dame. It's difficult when you're in that situation, and Pitt has come into Notre Dame and given Notre Dame problems.
Even though Notre Dame has won all those games up, and when was the last time they lost to Pitt? Wasn't it
20? Had to be.
Was
well,
it
Kelly didn't, so it had to be.
was it 08 or 09? What was the year that Golden Tate had the punt return that got that
Kelly
got
lost.
him close?
Kelly lost there in 2013, but that doesn't count. That's not what you're saying. Stephon Tuitt was kicked out of the game in the 2013 game.
They wouldn't have lost that game. So they did lose in 2013, but they beat him 10, 11, 12, 15, 18, and 19. But to your point, a lot of, especially the games at Notre Dame State, what's ironic, Tim, is the games at Notre Dame Stadium have been more competitive than the games at Pitt.
You don't bring your own. You don't bring your own guts. They're not into it as much.
The last two games at Pitt, Notre Dame wiped the floor with Pitt.
Yeah,
I mean 45-3. Although it was a little closer than 45-3 because they had the block punt, the two interceptions that set up scores.
Game.
Yeah, that offense did not play as 45-point good against Pitt. But Pitt was stunk, and they had their backup quarterback. Kenny Pickett didn't play in that game. And then, of course, in 2015, that game was not nearly as close as 42-30. They had the fumble return when Brandon Wimbush was in the game, and that game wasn't – they wiped the floor with Pitt that year. The games at home, however, to your point, have been a lot more competitive. The 2018 game, look, you needed a fourth-quarter comeback to win that game.
They just hang around. That's that's the concern I would have with that game.
Perfect. 2012 is the second. That's the last two times they've played at Notre Dame Stadium have been 18 and 12. And you've had to come back. My only thing about that game is, Tim, I think history, you're spot on. The thing that helps Notre Dame in that game is that Phil Jurkovic's probably going to be the other quarterback.
Yeah, that does change the dynamic a little bit. Yeah. They're still – it's been a long time. It was a much bigger deal to the 2020 team that Phil Jurkovic was the quarterback.
But it's to me, it's if Phil would have just kept his mouth shut before last year's BC game, then I don't think the Phil Jurkovic factor wouldn't have mattered, because there's who on the team is a former teammate of Phil Jurkovic. There aren't that many. The kids, the 2019 kids are – there aren't any. Are there any 2018 kids left on this team?
No, but maybe Kurt Heinisch whispering in Donovan's ear the entire week.
Yeah, but some of the 2019 kids that were, Phil Jurkovic and Cam Hart connected on some throws on scout team, right? Like things like that. But it was the comments he made in a game he wasn't even playing in. So it's kind of like, hey, you kind of ran your mouth and you weren't even playing us. This is our chance to kind of get it back. I think the other thing we're going to learn about that team is you're gonna find out if this team, Tim, specific to the Pitt game, there's a good chance, or not a good chance, if Notre Dame is what we think they should be at that point, which is at worst a one-loss team.
At worst. The logical way to say that is they're going to be a one-loss team right there.
Right.
They get one of the two.
So at worst, they're a one-loss team. Now what we learn is we saw that Marcus Freeman can handle adversity last year. There's another side to this coin, Tim, and that is, can you handle success? Mm-hmm. And so that's been the thing that's been so good about Alabama and what Kirby Smart is showing at Georgia, at least so far, is can you handle success? Meaning you go out and win big games. Can you keep that? And that's why the process that Nick Saban focuses on so much is so important, and why I've always been a process over results guy, because the process never changes. It's not about them. It's about us and what we're doing. But you're talking about an opportunity where you now have some success, and we have not seen this team enter November where they're playing for anything. They were a 3-loss team when they entered November last year. They were just playing for respect at that point in time. There's nothing on the line.
By bundling Clemson.
Right. You head into that Pitt game this year, Tim, and you're talking about end of October, October 28th. You have 3 games after that. You beat Pitt, and that would make them, 8-1? Correct?
Yeah, with the biggest
game. You're now a road Clemson game away from basically being a playoff team, essentially, or having the opportunity to be a playoff team.
Yeah.
That's one of those how do you handle success moments. And it's another example of what we're going to learn about this team that we don't yet know. We don't yet know how this team will handle success. We know how they handle adversity. We don't yet know how they're going to handle success. And that's something that we're going to have to learn about Marcus Freeman as well.
I think most programs, including Brian Kelly, when he had it going, handled success worse than they handled failure. I think that's why the Pitt game comes up. Remember the Pitt game where they just looked awful and almost lost at home in 2018? Came after the two best weeks they could have by destroying number 7 Stanford. That still mattered back then because it was number 7 Stanford. And going out and winning the game, I think, was the only one people could have picked them to lose that year at Virginia Tech because they had not yet won at Virginia Tech, and it was such a raucous atmosphere. And then you get Pitt. That is handling success. That's tough. You throw Northwestern in there as handling success, but part of that is your quarterback breaks his rib when he's running during the game, and it makes it difficult to win a game. I agree. That's a good judge of the coaching staff more so than anything else is the Pittsburgh game, because everyone knows you have to be up for road games, even though they're called Duke and Louisville. You have to bring something on the road to win these games.
You think about the Stanford game in 2018, Tim, to your point. We look at Stanford now and we think, well, this team doesn't care about football. They're no good. They don't have players. Notre Dame was 2-6, actually 2-7 since Brady Quinn. I mean, since 2008, but they were 2-6 under Brian Kelly under against Stanford. They also lost the 2009 game at Stanford, so they had really gone 2-7. That was a team that just was dominating you, and they dominated Stanford that night. Yeah. I mean, early on, KJ Costello made a couple plays here and there, but man, they were clearly the better team from start to finish. To your point, night game, top 10 matchup. You go on the road, enter the Sandman, Virginia Tech's this, they're that, and you win that game. And then like you said, you come back that next week. Here's another example of not handling success well. 2015. You're a team that you're in the top 4. You're in the college football playoff top 4. You just gotta handle your business the rest of the way. You just beat USC. You had a really tough road win over Temple. You just blew out Pitt on the road, and you've got 2 bad football teams coming up in the next 2 weeks: Wake Forest and Boston College. Wake and then Boston College, and they stink. And Notre Dame made both games more competitive than they should have been. And even before Notre Dame lost to Stanford, they drop out of the top 4 because they didn't handle success well.
Yeah. All you had to do was not play the way you did against Boston College. And now they would have dropped out in the loss to Stanford, but it's different. I mean, they deserve to drop out too. I don't think I've ever watched a team lose a game that was number 4 at such a crucial point and think they're going to drop them. And I don't think I have a great argument to the contrary here, because you are voting on what's going on for a whole season, and that game counted. Now,
you talking about Stanford game?
No, the BC game.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Now, correct. I felt if they beat Stanford, they should elevate back up, because that was a very good Stanford team still.
Oh, yeah.
Neither one happened, obviously. Actually, we have a good video of Priester and I standing under the goalpost when Conrad Ukropina drops that field goal right down to Johnny. That was that was a bad moment. That wasn't a playoff team though either. That actually wasn't. They were too injured to be a playoff team at that point. They had incurred. Remember, Kavari Russell was already out.
Oh yeah.
They had lost most of the guys. I know it got worse in Arizona because
Sheldon got hurt. That probably doesn't happen. You just can't repeat those type of things.
Suspended, Redfield suspended. There was plenty of.
Do those things happen if they're in a different game? That's the stuff we don't know.
Game, they don't know. Those don't happen.
Right. And so, to your point, though, Tim, is like that team did not handle success well, in my opinion. They didn't. And we've seen that before. The 2017 team, it's another example of a Notre Dame team that didn't handle success well. Because you made a great point. I mean, you're coming off in 2017, you're coming off of just several beatdowns of really good football teams. And you go to Miami and completely lay an egg they had got up to number 3. At that point in time in the college football playoff. You went out, you're in.
Yeah.
You went out, you're in. There's no way Notre Dame wins out and doesn't make the college football playoff that year.
If you do a list of name the surprising how a game unfolds covering Notre Dame football, I think that's number 1 for me is the Miami game. I was shocked that they got that offensive line. I was shocked you would bring that offensive line and running game and never have a chance to win at any point during the game. Once Brandon Wimbush missed the pass. Now, it all counts. Yes. But once you miss the pass, that counts. Look, we don't give Drew Pine a pass every time for missing the pass. Brandon Wimbush had to hit that pass.
Tim, I have said this a million times, bro. If Brandon Wimbush hits Equanimous, because that's the pass you're talking about, is he hits Equanimous on that post route on the opening drive, Miami folds like a cheap tent.
Yeah, because they are front run. They're a front running.
Their fans are. Their team is.
I shouldn't say their program's front running. Their current program is a front running program. It was not always a front running.
Their fans have been that way for a long time.
Yes. The old program was not that way.
such a loud environment, only because of what you did. That would have got them quiet. It'd have been a completely different atmosphere. And that's kind of the thing, though, is when you look at this football team, Tim, this program, that's a big thing. They don't handle success well.
Yeah.
And that's something that if Marcus Freeman is going to take this program to the next level, yes, he has to prove that he can beat the teams he's supposed to beat, but it's way beyond that. It's, can you beat the teams you're maybe not supposed to, or the teams that are at least on your level?
Sure.
And can you handle all ranges of adversity? Because adversity can be, my team is not ready because they think they're better than they are.
I would argue, to put a bow on this, they didn't handle success well after Ohio State. That was more success than adversity.
That's a good point.
Everybody, they were the ninth ranked team in the country still. Everyone thought Notre Dame is going to be the best one-loss team. The conversation that week was nationally, well, if Notre Dame wins out, they're going to get back in this. It's game 2.
Yeah.
I was part of the conversation, but it's game 2 and you scored 10 points. We probably shouldn't have been saying if Notre Dame wins out at that point, but I think everybody was. I think that was poor. I think they probably got, if not success, they had a lot of plaudits and attaboys. Great job. You guys are going to be great. Don't worry about it going on after that game.
We heard a lot of I gained a lot of respect for Notre Dame after this loss.
Right.
That's something I'm tired of. I'm tired of the Notre Dame program being a team that gains respect because the team didn't beat you as bad as everyone thought they're going to beat you. Like the 19 Georgia game. Boy, I gained a lot of respect for Notre Dame. I didn't. Like, you freaking should have won that game. Like, you gave that game away. You should have beat Georgia in 19. And that's something I'm tired of hearing, Tim. And that's something Marcus Freeman needs to change, is not hey, you put up a good fight. We expected you to get killed and you didn't. Good job. Or where your head football coach is saying, well, we only lost to Alabama by this much, but Ohio State lost by this much. I'm like, I hope I never hear those words come out of Marcus Freeman's mouth ever again. And he said that twice because he said it in 18 as well. It's like, bro, you lost by 27. The other team losing by 28 is not a moral victory for you, okay? But I don't want to hear those things, to be honest with you. Somebody just said in the chat, should have beat Georgia twice. Exactly. And that's what I'm tired. Notre Dame has been an almost program for way too long. And it's time for him to kick that. Let's talk about the ceiling, Tim, and what the realistic ceiling is. And let's first talk about the factors. What are the factors that go into what this ceiling could be? Obviously, it's your team and your talent, but it goes beyond that, Tim. It's not just about you.
No, of course not. I mean, it's 3 games where you're playing 3 teams that could beat anybody in the country in a given day: Clemson, USC, and Ohio State. It's 4 viable ACC opponents. It's interesting when you think about, they don't have Florida State this year, which is good timing. They also don't have Virginia and Virginia Tech this year. So where do you a couple just walk through wins? Now Wake will be fine, but Notre Dame can't lose to Wake with Sam Hartman. I cannot envision that right now, so I'm not going to envision that ever going into this game. So if you look at it, you're navigating 7 games, you're navigating some human nature in 4 of them, and navigating just a really good matchup of athletes in the other 3. Logically speaking, I'm always going to set the ceiling at 11-1 there, because I don't go into years thinking. So in 2020, before the season, we do our previews. I mean, our predict every game, which is stupid because you can't predict games when you have no idea who's quarterbacking.
But it's fun.
Get hurt. It is fun. Yeah, it's the only time I went through a whole season and got it right, including the rematch loss in the ACC championship game to Clemson and the playoff loss to Alabama, because it was so obvious only a couple teams could beat Notre Dame. Clemson, the better playoff team, because you knew they were going to be a better playoff team when you looked at Notre Dame. Had a great offensive line. We didn't know Kyron Williams was a great running back yet. They had a good quarterback. They had a good defensive line. There was a ceiling there. You figured they could maybe beat Clemson, but they weren't going to beat Clemson twice, right? That was an easy one to predict. I have trouble predicting the Ohio State, USC, and Clemson games, in that if I pick any to go 2-1 or 1-2 or 3-0, I guess it's mathematically impossible. 2-0 or 1-2, I could be wrong on both sides. Like I might get the USC game wrong, the Clemson game right, the Ohio State game wrong, or vice versa. There's so many. It's just 4 good teams playing against each other in those 3 matchups. There was no way Notre Dame was sweeping Clemson going into that year, or when that year started and Trevor Lawrence came back to play that game.
No. And
I mean, I guess if DJ played, they could have swept Clemson again, but that would be a different
possibly. And I think the frustrating thing is because they actually came out moving the ball very well against
They
Clemson
did,
early on and got 3 points out of it. You know, I mean, you got into Clemson territory on each of your first 3 drives, so you had a chance early to jump on them, and you couldn't do it. And so to
Lawrence
me,
was always there though for the next 40 minutes.
So to me, when I say ceiling, I don't think it, like, for the purpose of this conversation.
You're not
ceiling
saying
to me. What's that?
You're not saying necessarily 2-1 and 3-0 against those other teams. You're saying how good is this team with Sam Hartman and the talent?
Like when I'd say like ceiling is anything can happen, right? They could go 12-0 and you know, it could happen, but it's like, what is it? You want to be realistic, right? Like, to me, what is the kind of ceiling that you say this would be realistic and this would give them a chance to go into the postseason and be a playoff team? And to your point, I think 11-1 is exactly where it should be, because the nature of who you are, you do get your, I would argue, 2 toughest opponents at home. I think Clemson could end up being better by the end of the year, because I think Clemson's going to be better this year than they were last year, because they're going to be so much better on offense, I think, by that time. But, you know, right now, I think with what we know, that's a projection of what we know. I think Ohio State and USC are their 2 toughest opponents. They get them both at home. And I think that another team that has given them problems, as you said, has played them in really tough games, is a Pitt team, and you get them at home, and I think that helps. And then I think the NC State game, which is another dangerous game that not enough people are talking about, with Robert Denai as the offensive coordinator,
including us so far,
is spaced perfectly for them. It's perfectly placed for Notre Dame. It's game 3, because you're getting an extra game on NC State, because NC State doesn't start till week 1. You're starting week 0. So you get, which doesn't necessarily help you defensively, because one of those weeks is just a waste in regard to building for an NC State, but it helps you offensively. And that's the side of the ball where Notre Dame needs to make the most growth to be able to win a game like that. Because defensively, you've seen Robert and I twice now with 2 completely different teams. You know how he adjusts to different personnel. You saw him at Syracuse last year. You saw him at Virginia the year before with different personnel. Now, we've never seen him with Notre Dame, against Notre Dame, with Brennan Armstrong. But what's Brennan Armstrong going to be? Is he going to be the guy last year, the guy 2 years ago, someone in between? We don't know the answer to that. But it's going to be a tough game, because Tony Gibson's going to have that defense ready to play. It's also a defense that Sam Hartman's familiar with. They're also familiar with Sam Hartman.
Yeah, I was going to say that goes both ways.
It's going to be an intriguing matchup, but it's still a game Notre Dame should win, and I think it's placed perfectly for them in week 3. But it's not going to be a cakewalk. So to me, either you go 3-0 against the big 3 and have an NC State Duke type of loss, or you go 2-1 and then don't have those upsets. To me, is where I see the ceiling being 11-1, because I think against this, I think 11-1 gets Notre Dame the college football playoff.
I do too. And it's also important when we talk about schedules and playoff and everything. We are talking about qualifying for the playoff, getting into the playoff, and then we'll get to see how because we don't know how good Notre Dame can actually be until we see them play some football this year. Like, we think I think they are a major 6 for sure. Is it New Year's 6 now? Or it's New Year's 6. New Year's 6 quality team that can be a playoff quality team, but I am not prepared to say that they are a playoff win the game team. Because that's, as we know, that is very difficult to do. Now they have the quarterback to do it for the first time since
that's where sorry. That's where a lot of the optimism comes from, Tim.
Right.
And this is what I was kind of thinking in my head when I say it's not just about you, it's about what's around you. And that's the unique opportunity Notre Dame has, is because Alabama, not only do we not know who their quarterback is going to be, this isn't like, okay, it's a battle between Mac Jones and Bryce Young, or who's going to be the starter, Jalen Hurts, who led them to the championship game last year, or Tua, right? It's you know what I mean? Like, it's a different kind of quarterback battle. It's more of a Blake Barnett, Jacob Coker quarterback battle.
It's a lot different kind of quarterback battle than Jalen Hurts, Tua.
I'm trying to be nice. Okay. But then you look at Ohio State, their quarterback's going to put up numbers, but is he going to be the impact guy on top of the numbers? We don't know the answer to that. Georgia's going to have a new quarterback.
I want to be fair to Ohio State. Whoever wins that, I mean, I know who's going to win the job, but whoever wins the job at Ohio State, CJ Stroud was a superhuman against Georgia. Yeah. And when he needed to be in the final 20 minutes against Notre Dame, was a magician to make the plays he made.
Made some very tough throws.
Notre Dame might have bottled up their offense CJ Stroud was a winning quarterback in that game, and there's a reason that he was the difference maker in that game. The stats don't matter when you play the way he played when the chips were down. Will that happen again? That's why I say Trevor Lawrence was going to beat Notre Dame in that second game. You talk about, let's say Notre Dame goes down and scores 17 points in their first 3 drives. All right, well, now we have 35 more minutes of Trevor Lawrence. So it's different than if it's defense.
Buckle up, everybody. Buckle up. Brace yourself, because here it comes. Why do you say that, Tim? Well, because we saw it. Did you watch the semifinal game the year before?
Right.
When Ohio State jumped up 16-0, Trevor's like, I got this. You guys can't catch passes and get open. Fine, I'll go run for 100 yards. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, he was that kind of player, to your point. And you don't know that those teams had that this year. And that was kind of where I'm going with it, is outside of, Notre Dame's going to have a quarterback that's proven this year, but he's not proven in this uniform with this team in this system. But he's a 6th-year senior. There's a level of expectation of he's not going to go from here to here in the new system. But with those others, Georgia, it's a question mark. Who's their quarterback going to be? Stetson Bennett was no star, in my opinion. But you know what?
Really
that kid,
at the end of his career.
Yes, and he was big in big games.
Yeah.
We knew he was going to make big plays. Late in the game, he could make the plays, and CJ couldn't. Or I don't say couldn't, didn't. Yeah. Part of that's your team and other factors. I get all that. But that's just the reality of it. He was going to make plays when they needed him to make plays. I think Carson Beck's more physically talented probably than Stetson Bennett, but that doesn't mean a whole lot. Right. Phil Jurkovec was more physically talented than Ian Book was. Brandon Wimbush was more physically talented than Ian Book was in a lot of areas. So that to me is part of the optimism too, is there's just some years, Tim, where it's something you and I were discussing before the show. And I feel Notre Dame's had 2 teams that were capable of winning a championship in the years that they were playing for one. It was 15 Notre Dame and 17 Notre Dame. And if a couple things would have gone differently, those teams were championship caliber outside of one thing, and 15, it was the D coordinator. And then in 17, it was the quarterback late in the year. But those teams, in a lot of ways, because of why? Because that 15 team could have beaten Jacob Coker, Alabama in the championship game. We knew they could go toe-to-toe at Clemson. We saw them do it. In 17, we saw them go toe-to-toe with the national runners-up who took Bama, because that was not a great Bama team. You put either one of those teams in 19, and they're double-digit blowout losses probably to 19 to LSU. They're just 18 Clemson they would have had. Those teams it would have been more competitive than the 18 team was. But to me, 18 Clemson against 15 Notre Dame would have looked a lot like the Fiesta Bowl that year, where you got enough firepower to constantly get it within a score, but then they're going to go right down the field and score on you. You know what I mean? And that's just, to me, the way that it was. That's part of it too. There is no LSU 2019. At least that we know of right now. That team may emerge. I thought LSU was going to be good. I actually predicted LSU to be a playoff team that year.
I know. I remember.
I didn't predict that.
You know what I mean? That's the year I somehow won the bet, even though you got LSU in the playoffs. So I'm not sure who else you missed on there, because you did have LSU going to the playoffs.
Well, you suckered me into that last bet. You're like, hey, let's just, we had so people understand. Tim and I do sort of a friendly bet every year. Well, we'll make a bunch of predictions about the team and college football, and then the winner buys the other one dinner. And we tied, I believe, that year. And so we're like, hey, let's pick on the playoff game or the championship game. And Tim's like, I kind of hinted that he liked LSU.
So the championship game, and he said, I'll take Clemson. And I was like, I'll take LSU. I'll take LSU.
Well, it wasn't quite like that. It was kind of like giving you one, because you were talking about how much you loved LSU and everything. So I was like, I'll take Clemson. But I believe I picked LSU to win that game. But the point is, we don't know if that team is out there. I don't think that it is. I don't see that this year. I don't see a 2018 Clemson.
Yeah, we'll have to see Georgia's offense. We'll have to see Georgia's offense. And the problem with Georgia is it's going to be hard for them to be challenged too often with their schedule this year. So we might not know when they win every game by 14 points going into the SEC championship game how good they actually. Right. They're going to be very good, obviously. But if they're are they 18 Clemson, 19 LSU, or even are they 22 Georgia? Probably not.
Yeah,
I don't think they're 22 Georgia.
Yeah, well, which? Let me ask you this: which Georgia team do you think was the best, 21 or? Because I actually like the 21 team, because I think they were so much better on defense.
Yeah, the defense was ridiculous, but the 22 team also had that mental edge, the hardened, broken spirits from. I just thought they had that mental edge of a champion the entire time where you're like, it is going to take a lot to dethrone this team, man.
Yeah.
Not often do you see the championship medal go through the whole year. And I thought, I did not think they would. I didn't think Ohio State would play them as close as they did. I thought Ohio State played a great game that day. And then obviously the championship game was over before it started.
I actually predicted
they
Ohio
beat
State
a lot better team. They beat a lot better team in 21, to your point.
Yes. I actually predicted Ohio State to win that game, 38-35. And there was a point in that game where it was 38-35 Ohio State, because the one Achilles heel that Georgia's had the last 2 years is if you can throw the football and protect your quarterback, you can rip this defense up a little bit. We saw that with at the SEC title game the year before. We saw that in some other instances. Yep. We saw that with Ohio State last year. They could give C.J. Stroud time, and he can make plays. And, of course, he had big-time receivers, which helps. I mean, it helps when you're throwing to Marvin Harrison, But they had those same people against Michigan, and they couldn't do anything. They couldn't do anything in the second half. So I do think football is such a matchups game. It really is. And I don't see them being necessarily a whole lot better there this year, although I think they've recruited that position well. But I'm also curious to see how Georgia's going to handle. It's not always the 1 year that you lose a lot of players; it's the second year.
Yeah, no, it
lose
adds
a
up.
lot of
talent
players.
drain adds up on a couple.
Yeah, and then you see some guys leaving through the portal. Bear Alexander leaving to take a buyout at USC, a payout at USC, those type of things. So that's what I'm very curious about. But to your point, they're not going to be a super battle tested team by the time they get to the postseason, Tim. They're really not. I mean, they got Tennessee on the road. That could be a tough game. But before that, they're UT Martin, Ball State, South Carolina, UAB at home, at Auburn, home against Kentucky, at Vanderbilt, bye week, Florida in Jacksonville. They're moving that game this year, right? They're coming back in 24 because there were some field issues or something like that. It's going to be on a neutral field somewhere. Then Missouri at home, Ole Miss at home, at Tennessee, at Georgia Tech. So other than at Tennessee, those are all games they should win. It's not a tough schedule. And then who's the winner of the SEC West? We don't is it going to be LSU again? Is Bama going to bounce back? We'll find out. But they're not going to be super battle tested. But Georgia has always been a team that Notre Dame has matched up well against.
Yeah.
That's the other part of it, because Notre Dame's one of the few teams that on talent has been able to compete with them in the trenches, where they don't just dominate you in the trenches. Now, the reason Notre Dame lost to them in 2017 is because Notre Dame couldn't dominate them in the trenches like they did everybody else. But it was at least a stalemate. And I thought Notre Dame's D-line outplayed Georgia's offensive line, and I thought Georgia's defensive line outplayed Notre Dame's offensive line, and they were helped by the fact the backs made some really bad reads in that game as well. So those are all factors that go into what your ceiling is, and can you be a title team? Well, who? Let me hear about the other teams in the country. Oh, they all have Heisman Trophy guys coming back. Okay, that's a problem, because USC to me is not one of those teams, Tim. Because I'll say this:
their quarterback is, but not the
exactly.
Rest of it.
Yeah. You take Bryce Young off of that 2021 Alabama team, they're still 10-2, maybe even still 11-1.
Yeah,
they're just going to out talent people. You take Bryce off of this year's Alabama team, I don't know that they're 10-2. You take Caleb Smith, you take Stetson Bennett and replace him with Carson Beck. That team's still in the playoffs, in my opinion. Now, do they win it all? Do they beat Ohio State? No, I don't think that they do. Yeah. But they're still a playoff team. But you take Caleb Williams off that USC team last year, and they're struggling to make a bowl game, in my opinion. I really believe
he
that.
made everything go, because first of all,
exactly,
he gave you hope also for all the players that
you lose to Oregon State, you might lose to Washington State. There's a lot. You lost to Utah. There's some you lose to Notre Dame. Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, the way that Notre Dame ripped up their defense, he makes them way better than they are. Now they're ascending and they're getting there, and the talent is getting better and better and better. The culture, we'll see if the culture gets a whole lot better. But it's a different animal than Ohio State and those teams. And so that's kind of the thing that kind of encourages me is that, plus the reality of you have a quarterback that you think actually gives you a chance to be that kind of guy. Because I'm like, look, at Clemson, at Wake Forest, Tim, I've pointed this out. Sam Hartman last year goes out and throws for 330 some yards and 6 touchdowns and leads his team to 45 points against Clemson, and they lose. They've scored 34, 55, and 52 points in the last 3 years against North Carolina, and he's thrown for over 300 yards in each game, he's thrown for 3 to 4 touchdowns every game, and they're 0-3 in those games. Right? It's like you think like you give him that kind of team here that he's going to have, what's he going to do? And I think that's where some of the excitement comes from. But it's also the fact that I just don't see those other teams being what they've been. They're still going to be
Right.
very, very good. But you feel
Oh,
at
of
least the
course.
gap is closed in that regard because of the quarterback situation going both directions. in my view.
2018, after the playoffs, because of what they did at Notre Dame and Alabama, people were saying, is this Clemson team one of the best college football teams of all time? 2019, after the LSU championship, you thought, is this LSU the best offense of all time with a great defense? 2020, even though it was a weird year, you thought 3 of the 5 Heisman finalists and the Joe Moore Award offensive line is Alabama's offense, and a defensive line that handled Notre Dame pretty well.
Yeah.
Playoff team that handled everybody else well with their offensive line. That is another really great team. Your Georgia team in 2021, one of the best defenses of all time in college football. That wasn't Georgia last year, I agree,
No.
and that doesn't seem like anybody this year.
Mm-mm. Right.
So we went through 4 years where people were arguing right or wrong about one of the best offenses, defenses, or total teams of all time. That Clemson team's defensive line was better than Trevor Lawrence going into the playoffs. We just found out how good Trevor Lawrence was during the playoffs, and
right.
no longer were they better than Trevor Lawrence, but that's fine. I mean, and as you pointed out the other day, they were playing without their nose tackle for the entire playoff.
Right. Dexter, who's a first-round stinking draft pick.
You think Notre Dame's beating someone in 2018 without Jerry Tillery, both playoff teams?
Or yeah, I mean, take any one of the defensive linemen off. And that's the interesting thing about this year, Tim, that I'm very much looking forward to. I really am. I think it's going to be interesting because it makes for a fun. Forget Notre Dame, it makes for a fun season. I mean that's my whole thing is every team has bigger question marks than normal. Like last year was like what was the question on Georgia last year? Can they stay focused? Like that was it. There was no roster flaw that you look at. Boy, that could hurt them this year. And it's like no, they're pretty loaded everywhere. They lost 15 guys. Like 7 of them were backups. You know what I mean? Like, their third string tight end got drafted. You know, it's like backup offensive lineman. Yeah. I mean, it's literally backup offensive lineman get drafted. They didn't have the same, like they're losing 15 wasn't like LSU losing 15 and 8 and 19. Like they were just, I mean, their roster was just depleted after that 2019 season. I mean, they lost all the stars that factored into it. Georgia still had Jalen Carter and Brock Bowers and still plenty of guys coming back. And so it's going to be fun, Tim. It's going to make for, I think, a fun football. I think the SEC is going to be a very competitive league this year. I think the Big Ten is going to be, to me, very I think there's 3 teams in the Big Ten that have a shot to win the league this year because I think Penn State's getting better. I think Michigan's going to be a step down. Ohio State's going to be a step down. Penn State, I think, might be a step up if Drew Aller can can give some consistency. The Big 12 is going to be fascinating. And a battle that not a lot of people are talking about. I think the Pac-12 is going to have one of the most competitive who's number 1, 2 battles because you obviously Washington and USC.
Right.
But, I mean, Utah's going to – I mean, why are we not talking about the 2-time Pac-12 champs? Back-to-back Pac-12 champs as being a contender. I think Washington State's in the ascending program. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Oregon State's going to do this season. Jonathan Smith's building a really good football team at Oregon State. This is going to be Oregon, obviously, is another team that's going to be in this conversation. It's going to be a competitive year, and it's one of those times where if Notre Dame can handle their business, part of the thing that if you get to the playoff, what helps Notre Dame is you might knock out 2 to 3 teams that are capable of playing for a championship in the regular season. You can, if you're in the playoff, you at least knock 2 of them out.
You would knock 2 of them out for sure.
Right.
Yeah. And one of them, and Notre Dame, and this is a year where because of their schedule and last year, Notre Dame can lose a game.
Yes.
And make the playoff. That was also not the case in other years. They would not have made the playoff in 2020, save for the fact they could have won the ACC. Technically, could have won the ACC championship game, which I just didn't think was possible. But that was, that was not a playoff. If you lose that Clemson game, you're out of the picture for the playoffs.
Yes, and should have been.
Yes, should have been. Yeah, that's the way the schedule breaks. Then in 2019, I mean, I guess it took the Michigan loss, but they weren't going to. Beating Michigan when they got destroyed wasn't getting Notre Dame to the playoff anyway. That 2019 team, they had a really impressive loss, but you didn't feel like, boy, they deserve to go to the playoff if they could beat. First of all, they got beaten so badly by Michigan, it doesn't really matter how you go back and think about it. But
and that Michigan team was ranked 19th at the time.
Yeah, that's not
if Notre Dame beats them, they were coming off of a loss to Penn State. They had already dropped 2 games. They still had Ohio State to come. Right. They had lost. Remember, they got blown out by Wisconsin that year. they probably drop near the bottom of the top 25, if not out, if Notre Dame beats them. So what would be, and this I've pointed this out in 19. Notre Dame's only win over a ranked opponent that year was Navy. That was it. And so you lost to a one-loss Notre Dame team that year. I don't know that they're in,
but this year is, and
right.
this year is
right. And I'm glad that 19 team didn't get in because that would have been ugly. Because it would have been what the 19 you'd have had. I think Oklahoma probably doesn't get in. Would you agree with that? I think Oklahoma was the 4 seed that year, correct?
Right.
If Notre Dame were to get in, if this is the let's say they go on the road, blow Michigan out, and just blow everybody out, and they're like, wow, did you see how well they played Georgia? Blah 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 blah. Whatever. They make the playoff. I think they're in over Oklahoma. That's just it. I mean, let's see. They would get in over Oklahoma if they got in. Is the argument that I'm making.
Sure.
I'm not saying they should have. I'm saying they would have. They would have got in over Oklahoma.
Yeah.
They're playing LSU in the first round.
Yeah, that's somehow I didn't put that together out of the way right away. That would be it. That would be a problem.
That'd be a problem. And let's just say hypothetically.
Don't even say hypothetically.
They are no.
Okay.
They get a 3 seed. That's my
right.
No,
no.
Come on, Tim. Brian, we're in fantasy land now, man. Okay,
he threw 60 touchdowns, Brian, and I'm not talking about his career. I'm not talking about his career.
No. What I'm saying is, let's say hypothetically somehow Notre Dame gets in as a 3 seed for some reason. I don't know why that would happen or how that would happen or whatever. I mean, because Clemson was the 3 seed, right? And Ohio State was the 2 seed. I don't know. Let's just say somehow they get in. Let's say, I don't know, LSU loses to – let me go to Clemson. So let's say Clemson – loses to, I don't know, they blew everyone out that year. Let's say they lose at North Carolina. That was the only competitive game they played all year. It's literally the only competitive game they played all year. They won 21-20. Remember that game?
Yeah.
Let's say they lose that game and somehow Notre Dame's a 3 seed. The same thing happens against Ohio State. I mean, if Ohio State loses a game and they're playing Clemson, I mean, that team was going to get destroyed by whoever they played. Like the gap between Notre Dame and those teams is enormous.
It just would have been better if it wasn't Michigan.
Right. This year is a year where you don't feel that way for a host of reasons. Skill talent that has potential. And that's where we're going to end this one, Tim, is if Notre Dame is going to reach their ceiling, what are the things that have to happen? What are the things that have to not go right? Like, okay, everything goes, but realistically, what will happen if this team is 11-1 in a playoff spot? What needs to go right for them to get there, Tim?
We discussed where the playoff value is on Notre Dame's roster on Irish Illustrated's podcast, and quarterback, cornerback, starting running back, offensive line, because as much as you could say they need to find one starting guard, I mean, compared to everywhere in the country, let's go ahead and start with the 2 tackles Notre Dame has. Let's start with what Notre Dame has at offensive line and go against somebody else and try to tell me they're not a playoff caliber offensive line. So offensive line, cornerback, starting running back, quarterback are playoff caliber. I think with the youth at linebacker augmenting the veterans at linebacker, it's a quality New Year's 6 group, assuming that youth does augment the starters at linebacker. I really like their backup linebackers, which is, I liked Prince Kollie too, actually. But when Prince Kollie left, I thought, well, he left and Jalen Snead will play more Will now. And Nolan Ziegler can play more Mike and he'd be the backup. And I love Osbury's future. Plus Rover's not even a starting position anymore.
It's really not.
The nickel position is the starting position, and Jack Kaiser can move over to Will. So I like that. I like the linebacker group at that level. I wouldn't put them playoff level yet. If all those positions I just said play where I think they can play, that's the first thing that happens to me to make the playoffs. Your best players, I think your best players are indeed your best players. They play like your best players. None of these games like, well, yeah, he played well against North Carolina, but did you see what happened to him against Stanford? That's not supposed to happen when they're your best players. I want to keep the other position groups out of it because no one can really come on and say safety is a playoff level safety group to me right now. We're just keep that out of that. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is I think Ohio State, USC, and Clemson have to be really good. Yeah. Because you have to be allowed to lose to one of them and impress everybody when you beat the other 2. This is a weird feeling for people, but you're going to be rooting for USC.
Yeah.
You need USC
Same
to be
with Ohio
a prime
State.
game. Same with Ohio State.
If you win that game. Well, if you win that game or if you lose that game, you need that team to just blow everyone else out. I mean, you lose to Ohio State, they kick a last-second field goal, and then they just annihilate everyone else. Like,
Right.
okay, yeah, you're probably a playoff team.
I think you need a guy to emerge at receiver. I think Jaden Thomas has the lowest floor. Excuse me, has the highest floor. I said that completely wrong.
I know what you meant.
Jaden Thomas has the highest floor. I want to see. Pete Sampson made a good point on our podcast. He said, "What if Tobias Merriweather played in the blue gold game with Sam Hartman? He might have looked a little bit better than Jaden Greathouse did that day." And yeah, that's true. So Tobias Merriweather or Jaden Greathouse, I think they need a receiver to step up beyond who we think will step up. Like I think Tobias will step up. Can Greathouse become a starter at the end of the year? Can Chris Tyree become what the coaches keep saying he
That's
can
a
be?
big one. Yeah.
So somebody there. And then finally, people took this wrong because people take things wrong, but I meant it as I said it. I like Notre Dame's defensive line, but I see at the playoff level 8 really good backups.
As of right now,
I see 8 really good backups. I don't see. And now Gabriel Rubio could be a starter. Maybe Gabriel Rubio emerges. Maybe Howard Cross has 12 games like he played September and stays healthy because he gets time with guys.
Or like he
him.
did in the bowl game when he was fresh.
Right. Or maybe Jordan Botello has a bowl game season 7 times against the 7 best teams when he comes to play. He can go ahead and not play well against Tennessee State. It's going to be
Jordan
okay.
Botelho needs to play great in 5 games. That's it. Like seriously, play great against NC State, Ohio State, Duke, USC, and Clemson. That's it, dude. Give me that.
That was my third one. Would be the defensive line is not 8 good backup defensive linemen for a playoff team.
I'm gonna say this for you, Tim. I'm gonna give you a better way of saying that. That's not going to piss people off.
It can't go worse.
Right. I'm going to give you a better way of saying it that's not going to piss people off, even though I'm saying the exact same thing you're saying. The defensive line conversation needs to turn from potential to production. Because the reality is I think you would agree that there's a lot of guys on that D-line that have the potential to be much better than what you're referring to.
Yeah, 10 maybe. I think 10 possibly.
Yeah, I think Jordan Botelho could be a stud, but you know what? He's had like 2 games like that in his entire career. Guy's going to be a senior. It's not talking about like some redshirt freshman like Josh Burnham, right? We're talking about, Josh Burnham's a freaky athlete. Javonte Jean-Baptiste has some skill. Riley Mills, I think, flashes some really impactability. Go down the line with those type of guys. But right now, it's all potential. Could be conversation. So to me, to your point, if the conversation of the defensive line is about their production and not their potential, because if they're not producing, we're still talking potential.
Yeah. Yep.
Right? If it becomes about their production and not their potential, then I think it'd be pretty good. And it reminds me a lot of the 2018 off defensive line, where in 17 you saw flashes of what Dalen Hayes could be, Kareem could be, Tillery could be. But in 18, they kind of all put it together, and they went from a bunch of guys with potential to, well, let's see what they could do now, to you had NFL guys coming off the bench on that 2018 team on the edge. And so to me, that's kind of where this defensive line is can they? Sure, Jordan Botelho's got the potential to do it, but like there's this assumption, I think, amongst Notre Dame fans, well, yeah, of course he's going to play like the bowl game every year. Really? Why hasn't he done it then?
Yeah.
Right? Why did it not take till then? I mean, so he's got to show it consistently. I think Riley Mills played well in that game. I mean, he had some big moments in that game. He said but can he do it consistently and not just flash a series here and there? I mean, for the last 2 years, when you take the best 10 series that Riley Mills has had, it's really good.
They moved him inside for Virginia when he was playing outside, and he was the best player on the field. It was
actually the opposite.
Opposite way, inside.
They moved him outside when he'd been playing inside.
We thought he should play outside all of a sudden.
Right. And then they put him there, and then they don't use him the same way this year. You go back and watch him against Wisconsin in 2021. He was really good that day. But can he do that against Ohio State this year? Can he? Because he didn't last year in those big games. Can he do it against Clemson? Can he? So those are the things, Tim. It's always about, I think you nailed it with that one, because you can't at Notre Dame, because you're not going to have a Joe Burrow 49-point per game offense. I love Sam Hartman. I love the receivers. Right. They're not that. I love Tobias Merriweather. He's not Jamar Chase. Right. I think Deion Colzie's got a lot of potential. He's not Justin Jefferson if he pans out. They're just not that team.
Just say 60 every time you want to think about Joe Burrow. That's 60.
Right.
In a year.
They can't afford to not have an elite a big-time defensive. I don't think it has to be elite. It has to be really good. They can't be a playoff team if they're not really good. They play too many good offenses. Every team that they play this year that's going to be their big games, they're going to have to come up with a lot of stops because they're too good on offense. And so if you're not playing good on defense on the defensive line, you're a linebacker. You don't have Jalen Smith at linebacker. You can talk about, oh, I like the veterans, and I do as well. I defend J.D. Burchin and Jack Kaiser on the show all the time. I love the backups, but they're not Jalen Smith. It's not,
and that's why I can never elevate them to the other level. Like
right.
corner.
It's not even Tranquil and Coney in 18 was a really dynamic 1-2 punch inside. I don't see that right now from like Kaiser and Bertrand. They're not that good to that level. And so to me,
but they have better backups because Coney and Tranquil couldn't come out of a game ever.
Correct. Because when Tranquil went down, you brought in Drew White, right? Who was, I think, a redshirt freshman that year.
Yeah.
And Osmar hadn't had his breakout yet.
No.
And Jeremiah Wusu-Koroma was hurt. He was out all year. Got hurt. He went out for the year again. It was the second game of the year, right?
Yep.
It was after Michigan, so I forget which.
It was practice week, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, who'd they play second week of the
Ball State?
Ball State. Yeah, he got hurt either the week before or the week after that game. I can't remember. So to your point, yes, they didn't have the depth. My point, however, is they don't have the kind of players where if the D line's not playing well, they can still go make plays. They don't have Jalen Smith.
No,
they can do. They don't have Jeremiah Wusu-Koroma. And that's why the defensive line is, look, I don't care how – I love Notre Dame's corners. I think this is the best cornerback room that Notre Dame has had since Lou Holtz was the head coach. Now,
there's
I know the 2018 – to your point, the 2018 team was pretty good in the starting lineup. Will this team be as good in the starting lineup as that? We'll see. But it's the depth.
But yes. I mean, the 2002 corners were probably better than this pair, but once one guy got hurt, it was over.
Yeah.
That was it.
Of what we know about them, maybe. Now, I think this tandem has a chance to be the best cornerback tandem they've had since what they say, like Tom. Who was the sidekick to Tom Carter in 2020?
Well, they were so good they were able to move Bobby Taylor to safety. Is how good it was when Tom Carter was there in '92.
Yeah. So. I mean, that's kind of, but I don't care how good you are at corner. If your defensive line can't put pressure on the quarterback at Ohio State and USC, and then it doesn't matter. They're going to eventually make plays. Yeah. It doesn't matter. So I think that's the to me, quarterback on offense and defensive line are if I had to pick one position on both sides of the ball that has to play at a big time level, or they can't win. I think the receivers don't have to be big time. They don't need Tobias to be Will Fuller 2015. They don't need Deion Colsey to be even Miles Boykin 2018. They just need those guys to make plays when the ball comes your way. There's enough spread around talent. Your offensive line has to be pretty good, but your offensive line can be great and your quarterback not be very good, and you still lose. We've seen a lot of that at Notre Dame.
I would be surprised if that happens to Sam Hartman, though, if he has a really good offensive line, because
correct,
the running game will then allow him to dictate.
Correct.
Everything.
That's why I think that this team is going to be pretty good, but it needs to happen. He needs to be that guy, in my opinion. And then the defensive line has to play at a high level. Now the side, now it comes to what do the complementary pieces look like? To your point, it's not even just about when I think of so-and-so has to step up, Tim, it's not so that means Tobias has to have 75 catches for 1,200 yards. It's not what I'm talking about. It's, you got to be productive, but when it's 3rd and 7 and you're down 4 and you're playing Ohio State, can you go make that big play? Because Will Fuller dropped too many passes. Well, he never did when it mattered. I mean, he was money. He was clutch. He was going to make plays when you needed him. Temple, USC, all the time. He did. LSU in 2014 in the bowl game made some really clutch. Remember the one where Everett just like throws it up and you're like, where's that going? And like Will goes up and catches it. You need those guys who are going to make those money plays, and that's the thing. When Marvin went out against in the semifinal, none of the Ohio State receivers did that. So talented guys, but at the end of the day, who's going to step up and make those big plays? They did that against Notre Dame. When CJ was putting those balls into tight windows, they were making those catches on the sideline. So it's not even necessarily about who becomes the guy from a Michael Floyd, Will Fuller, Golden Tate production standpoint. It's more about, do they make the money plays in the big games? That's what you need to see. And it can be more than one. It can't just be Tobias, because in those situations, like it wasn't Will Fuller that made the money plays against Boston College. It was Chris Brown. Will had probably the worst game of his season that year because he had 2 bad drops and, but Chris Brown stepped up. Amir had some big plays that year in some clutch moments. And that's the question that I'm going to have is, what do the complementary pieces look like? And then the other part is, to me, they need about 3 or 4 guys that we're not sure of right now to step up and be guys. I'm thinking of, do I like the potential of the backup running backs? I do. But right now I have no clue who's going to even be healthy, much less who's going to be that number 2 guy.
Yeah.
right? Because you're going to need that guy at some point in time next year.
Oh, yeah, the whole narrative that they didn't need Logan Diggs. I mean, what if you got the equivalent of Logan Diggs in the transfer portal right now? You'd be pretty excited.
If Notre Dame went out and got a running back that had 822 yards last year and had a couple hundred yards receiving, and you'd be like, oh, wow, that's a great addition to the roster. But when it's going outward, it's no better. They're fine.
That does matter. Yeah, Estime staying healthy, and more so than that is, well, not more so, along with that is one of those guys emerging. Jadarian Price coming back would be fantastic. Yeah. He has been too long penciled in as an immediate star after a guy that ruptured his Achilles.
Right.
Look, they loved him before it happened. And then he had
the best running back.
Yes, but that's not the situation now. So he has to. And I keep saying about Jadarian Price, it is not that big of a deal if he's back in mid-August. It is a very big deal if he's back in mid-October.
Yes.
And he's running well, and he makes your second half of your season. Jadarian Price is a part of your offense.
Well, we saw this with 2018. I mean, you could go out and get out of that Michigan game without Dexter Williams.
Right.
You know, you could grit out ugly wins over Vanderbilt and Ball State and go down to Wake Forest and play an outman Wake Forest team, and you're 4-0 and you're pretty good. When you then add Dexter Williams in week 5 to that offense looked completely different.
Well, you might not have beat Virginia Tech because think of the run.
Correct.
That was a pretty big deal.
It was huge. I mean, you need that kind of. So to your point, you can get through the first 3-4 games without Jadarian being that guy, because Jabron Payne's a good running back. Jeremiah Love is a very talented freshman running back, but at some point in time, you're going to need Jadarian Price to be healthy and ready to help, and not just healthy, because he'll be healthy. It's back to the player he was.
Yeah. There's a difference between being legally able to practice. That's when they say he's coming back. He's 100% ready to go. 100% ready to go in coach speak actually means he's cleared for practice and we can hit him. It has nothing to do with looking like you're supposed to look. So I agree that running back would be part of that.
Yeah. Defensively, you just need the safeties not to get you beat. That's because, look, Tim, even LSU 19, Clemson 18, there were parts of that Clemson 18 team that if you could take advantage, if you could hold your water against others, you can beat them here. And we saw that with Notre Dame. If Notre Dame had a better quarterback, they ripped those safeties up because they had some. I mean, you remember the Chase Claypool and Michael Young both have deep crossers, overs. They just outran the safeties. That if the quarterback had time and then had the guts to make those throws or big plays on top of the post to Miles Boykin, but you just couldn't take advantage of it because you were whipped in other areas, right? And so to me, you don't have to be great everywhere. You just have to not have positions that get you beat. And to me, that's the safety position. It's not going to be great this year. Could it be, if Xavier Watts steps up, that's big. If Ramon Henderson can just be consistent, you're solid there. And Antonio Carter, and then now DJ Brown's your number 3 or number 4. Thomas Harper's healthy. I think you're going to be good there with him in the nickel, et cetera, et cetera. You just got to, but you don't need them to look like 2018 Alohi Gilman, Jalen Elliott, or Harrison Smith in 2011. You just need them to not get you beat. And last year, I thought they actually did a pretty good job of not getting you beat. 2021, they almost got you beat a couple times. You know what I mean? And they got you beat once. In the bowl game. Yeah. The bowl game was if you could just tackle and cover, you're not blowing a 28-7 lead in that game. Just don't get you beat. But that only works if the front 7 and the corners are where they need to be. And so that's the thing for me, Tim. I think you nailed that one. I think the D-line turning the potential into on-field production is going to be the key. Because if Riley Mills and Jordan Patelho are who I think they can be, and Jason Onye can just be in the fall what he was in the spring, we know who Howard Cross is.
Yeah.
We know what he can bring to the table. Now, all of a sudden, it's like, okay, now you got a chance to be a really disruptive defensive line. Because that's the thing about last year's line. They weren't disruptive enough. I mean, Foskey had some big moments, but he had one of the least impressive 14 tackle for loss, 11 sack seasons I've ever seen, in my opinion.
He did have a more impactful 2021.
Even though his production wasn't as good.
No, but he was forcing fumbles when he was making the plays. When you force 5 fumbles and having a 6th one called back, you've done your
and
job.
You're clutch.
Yeah.
He would make plays when they needed him to make plays. And then last year we didn't see it. So we need to see that too. So it's going to be interesting. And then if those things don't happen, now we're back to the 8-4, 9-3 conversation, right? And that's what's going to be fun about this team, and that's something I'm very much really excited for. Tim, have you got to the point yet? It's still early, so I don't have this. yet. Have you made your season prediction yet, or are you still kind of working through? I'm
No,
still
I
working through all
usually
that.
wait till August and then I raise it by one game and make myself wrong because of that. Because I get excited watching. I get excited watching some practices and camps and there's
Yeah.
no. There haven't been many times I watch August camp and I, even though I should have a couple times, gone away and been like, ooh, it's not as good as I thought it was going to be. Usually you think they're going to be better.
Did you cover the team in 07? Were you here in 07?
No, 08 was my first one.
Okay,
Yeah.
because that's something Lou Emoji has said to me one time when I was working. He's like, "Yeah," he goes, "I remember walking out of the first couple practices of the 07 season, thinking this is going to be a long year." I'm sure Priester shared some similar stories about that football team. Like they knew pretty early on in fall camp this is going to be a.
I moved back from Atlanta for the one day before the Georgia Tech opener and went to the game.
Oh.
And I just looked out there and was like, what the hell have they been doing in practice? Because, you're a little removed from it back then.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that was something else.
Yeah. Yeah, that was rough. But no, to your point, I mean, I think the only other year that I had concerns was 16. Just because at the practices we saw, like I remember the moment it hit me that because I went on Bill King's show and I said this team is either going to be really good or they're going to implode. And the final straw for me was, remember that practice we were at where the offense was just so lackadaisical, so lack of energy, just so that Brian Kelly made them run laps.
Yes,
like
that's right.
When was the last time a Division I football team had to run a lap for
Kelly
what I mean?
Made
like
a good point that year. I asked him the next year. I didn't ask him this that year. He wouldn't have answered. The next year I asked him, but going into 17, when they obviously were going to be decent at least, if not really good, decent. At any point. Might have been a summer conversation. At what point did you think there could be a problem in 16? He said, I thought we needed to get off to a good start to build confidence for our guys that needed it. And when we didn't, I knew we were going to have a problem. And I think that's in retrospect for a veteran coach, even though obviously he did a poor job that year. I think it's probably one of those things where, maybe if they beat Texas, they find a way to lay a complete and total against Michigan State. So they're just a bad 6-16 instead. And they win a couple other games. They still would have been a bad team, but you could probably win a couple games that you would not have blown. But that's enough conversation about 2016 as compared to 2023, Brian.
Yeah.
That would be a bad situation.
No. And I don't see that here because I don't see the same. I mean, who your quarterback is going to be. You don't have because there was, I mean, I'm sure you were hearing it too. I was hearing so much about what was going on behind the scenes that you're like, this is not good, man.
Right.
And this could be, I mean, kids can't go work out in the gym. They have to get like private, they have to get like memberships to local gyms to get good workouts in. You talk about just a lack of leadership. Your starting quarterback is out getting hammered, two night before game, spring game. And you're just like, this team's going to have some trouble. But it was a culture problem, much more so. Like that team was not a playoff team talent-wise. But they were at least an 8-9 win team that year, talent-wise. At least. That was a terrible schedule.
That's where traits came from. It was the culture of that team. It was a total flip in 17. And Drew Tranquil and those guys helped when you flip the culture and you have guys like McGlinchey and Tranquil and Quentin Nelson leading it.
The moment that I knew 17 was going to be good was when I listened to Drew Tranquil after the Georgia game. Just sit there solemnly saying, and I'm thinking like, okay, how's this going to respond? Because, we still had the bitter taste of 2016 in our mouths. And he just kind of goes like this and the strong Christian kid, always smiling, always happy. And he goes, I feel really bad for the teams that we're about to play.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that now. Yeah.
And you're like, dude, you've literally gone 5-9 in the last year plus. You've got
you're 5-11 actually. If you keep going,
if you go back in, that's a good point.
That's really bad.
Yes.
I mean,
and you could go 7-11, and then your last 2 wins were super ugly over bad. I mean, the point is, at that time there was no reason for optimism on that football team, none. And you're looking at that receiving core, and you're like, this is a problem. And then this cat goes and he says, I feel really bad. And then I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And you're like, at least this team has leadership. That's what I thought. At least this team has leadership. And then by the end of the next game, you're like, this team's going to be a problem for people. You just ran for 500 yards on a Boston College team that currently has 2 starting defensive linemen in the NFL on that team.
And Harold Landry was thrown around like a rag doll the whole game.
Yes. Zach Allen and Harold Landry could do nothing in that game. I mean, and so you're like, okay, this team's going to be a problem. I feel like this team is going to be similar in regard. I don't question the leadership of this team, Tim. I don't think that, like, we don't know necessarily who all the leaders are going to be, but you look at that offense, you're like, okay, you've got Sam Hartman, you've got Audric Estime, you've got Zeke Correll, you've got the two tackles.
Well, I think you have Joe Alt too ahead of schedule. Joe Alt is a
that's what I said, the two tackles.
The two tackles, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Agree with you, because like Blake Fisher also brings a level of that. He's doing things off the field the right way, and he's putting in the work and doing those type of things. It's like I don't question Tim the leadership of that unit defensively. You've got J.D. Bertrand, you've got Jack Kaiser, you've got Cam Hart, you've got Howard Cross, you've got enough leadership. Even DJ Brown, from a leadership standpoint, can give you something, even though he's not really all that good of a football player, in my opinion.
But he's a respected guy in the locker room. He definitely is. He would not. They would not have brought another 6th guy back in that situation.
No way.
Well, I guess they needed safeties at the time, but still, but I think that was taken into consideration.
Agree. I think they would have just said leave, and we're going to move one of our corners to safety if he wasn't a really quality locker room presence to that football team. So I just feel like those type of things, to me, Tim, I don't question that. And that's why it's not something I often talk about. Last year, I had some questions about who the leadership is going to be, because a new coach, and I think there was a lack of leadership early. And not just coming from us, but Michael Mayer comments that he made in what we knew that was going on behind the scenes. Like, there's some problems here. And then they got it fixed. And now I think they're going in the right direction. I think now you at least have a team where everybody's going in the same direction. And I don't think that was true last year. There were some other guys who were like, yeah, we're going here, but I'm also doing my thing over here. And I don't think that's as much of at least as of right now, is not as much of a problem for this football team.
Yeah, I tend to wait till as late in August as I can to do that.
Yeah,
game by game finals.
I'm still breaking down other teams. I did watch Duke's spring game the other day, and I'm telling you, they spring games don't mean a whole lot, but they do have some good athletes on offense. They have the kid that battled Riley Leonard for the starting quarterback job, moved to receiver. I hadn't really paid attention to him last year. Had decent numbers. You watched him in that game. Like this is going to be if Notre Dame is a playoff team this year, Tim, this is the one prediction I have. If they're a playoff team, they will have absolutely earned it. Because there's a lot of quality football teams on the schedule. There really are.
I have one for you here that's a schedule quirk, and I brought this up in my Monday Musings column. When we leave Duke, the press box that night, because inevitably they're going to make that a night game on us. They always do those type of things to us.
If the 19 game was a night game, Tim, this is going to be
the season is half over on September 30th. That's how busy and then they still have to keep playing. They're not done. They have to play Louisville right after that too.
I didn't even think about that. No, you're correct, because they play Ohio State on the 23rd. That's right.
Insane.
Wow.
Yeah.
So basically, if you're going to beat Notre Dame,
how's the season half over on September 30th?
To your point, if Notre Dame's not a playoff team, it'll be because of what happens in the first 6-7 weeks, not because of what happens in the last 5 or 6.
That was my point. Yeah.
Yeah. So if they can, and that's why getting out of that 2 back-to-back road games is so important. Going into USC with 0-1 losses, I like Notre Dame in that matchup. I do. So good stuff, Tim. We're going to do a mailbag next, right? So we haven't had surprisingly, there hasn't been a ton of great questions so far. We've only got 5 stars so far. So if you guys have some mailbag questions, get those in now. Otherwise, Tim is going to have the shortest mailbag segment ever, and we definitely don't want that. So before we go, though, folks, do us a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, and, of course, sign up for the message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So the first question that we'll have here, Tim, T. Guns, Crocs, and Glock says, what are the odds that Coach Holtz put a championship curse on Notre Dame before he left, like Babe did when he left Boston?
I do not think Coach Holtz has ever rooted against Notre Dame, but there have been coaches, and I don't mean Charlie Weiss, that could have put a curse on Notre Dame when they left and also while they were there.
Yeah, I can think of the guy that proceeded. Lou Holtz is definitely one. He was doing seances in South Bend trying to put voodoo curses on Notre Dame the way that his tenure went. Yeah.
I'm sure Brian BK wouldn't be too happy. Not you, Brian.
No, I think he's the kind – he strikes me as the kind of guy that would root against the team to have success, because then he doesn't want it. God forbid anyone think that someone could do better than me, or
he'd probably be happy to see them in a playoff game situation. Then he could be happy for your ex-teammates type of thing. But, no, I don't think Coach Holtz did that.
No, I mean,
There's something though.
he loves this program. I mean, it's kind of like Jerry Faust. I mean, you know this. Jerry Faust had no business being head coach of Notre Dame. But I've seen him around enough to like, this guy genuinely has a tremendous love for Notre Dame. And that's how Coach Holtz was. And you know what? Charlie's that way. I mean, Charlie had reasons. The way that his children were treated by some fans, and it wasn't most, but it was a vocal enough group of obnoxious, really ridiculous people to say, I would have a hard time, and I'm not even a parent. I would have a hard time still having affection for that place, right? And he does. He still does. Yeah. From everybody I've ever talked to, he still does. Maybe not always of the people, but he still loves Notre Dame. I don't think Brian Kelly ever loved Notre Dame. It was just Brian Kelly's the TO of coaches. Love me some me. There's no doubt about it.
I think Kelly peaked in his Notre Dame allegiance in that 17-18 when he restored what he lost in 16. I think that was his wheelhouse, 17-18. And then you could see in 2020 when they had such a good year, you're looking like, why are you talking about your talent level right now? After your playoff loss, man. It's a playoff game. Let's move on.
Right. Where I was just probably the most pissed I've ever been is when I'm watching the Wisconsin game in 21. Because if you remember, I couldn't attend certain games that year because of the vaccine stuff. And that was one of those ones I couldn't be at. So I had Vince at that game. And I'm watching and I'm listening to Joel Klatt talking about basically what he's been told about this team. And basically like talking the team down the entire time. And I'm like, where it's coming from. And you're just like, like this is what you've spent the last 2 years doing is talking down your time. Bro, that you're in year 11, 10. Who's responsible for that? Who's responsible for acquiring that talent? Those are two very frustrating years. And he would act like it was not in his control. It's like you inherited it. Like you're in 2010 and 2011 again. So it was ridiculous. All right. Rob Osgood said, welcome LT, that'd be Logan Thomas to the class. Is his recruitment an indicator of a shift to a 3-3-5? I'm going to ask you this question first, Tim, and I have an opinion on this too. I know the recruits all have length, size, and speed. So is it an indicator of a shift to a 3-3-5?
I don't know that's an indicator to a shift to 3-3-5. I do think there's a shift in body type that is, as Rob mentions here, that the length and the speed. But I feel like they still need to be multiple 4 down. But as we talked about previously on this podcast, nickel is the actual starting position now in college football for most teams. And I think it will be again for Notre Dame. It was obvious it had to be last year because Tariq Bracy was just one of the best players on the team and he had to be in that spot. I don't think it's a full shift to a 3-3-5. I do wonder every once in a while I hear it was a transcript with either, can't remember if we were talking to Washington or Golden when he said we can go to a 4 down. I was like, what do you mean you can go to a 4 down? You have to be able to go to a 4 down. You play a 4 down. And then I thought to myself, now I know what they're working on in the spring. So this is not without merit, but I don't think it will be a full shift. I think multiple is the future.
Agree. I think they're going to want to try to find more ways to get into a 5 defensive back alignment.
Yes, I think the 5 is key there.
Yes, and they want to be able to do it out of 4 down, and they want to be doing it out of 3-3. And I think that I'll say this. I don't think Logan Thomas's recruitment has anything to do with that. I think it has more to do with why you shifted Josh Burnham and Junior Tuilamaka to linebacker.
Right.
Recruiting a Preston Zinter and just the overall numbers they're recruiting a linebacker. They're not pushing for guys in the 23 class or 24 class the way that a team that wants to be a base 3 down defense would be pushing for guys, in my opinion. So I think they want to be a hybrid team, to your point, Tim. I think they want to be a team that consistently has 5 defensive backs on the field. And honestly, when you look, part of that's schedule driven. Has to be.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
When you look at the 3, go ahead, Tim.
What quality rover? I mean, like it could be personnel driven too. Like you don't have to do that when Jeremiah Usu-Koromoa is your rover. You're not going to keep getting Jeremiah Usu-Koromoa as your rover necessarily. Now, I love Jaden Osbury. I like him at rover too. But once again, we're comparing Butkus Winter to a guy I really like after watching film in a Blue Gold game. So
I think even then, I think you could make a case that you need to have more nickel options because when you're playing Ohio State, Clemson, and USC in the current versions, if you're having Jeremiah Usu-Koromoa playing rover the entire time, you're now taking out of him out of his wheelhouse of impacting the football because they're going to run more vertical routes where you can say, hey, look, go with a nickel, then move him inside, let him, like they did that a lot against North Carolina in 2020. Is they had him coming off the edge. They'd put 5 DBs in the field. They went to sort of like a mix between 3 and 4 downs, if you remember. And then he was attacking off the edge and playing inside backer at times in that game because of the nature of how they were playing. And they did it, I think, out of a 4 down most of the time, but still did some 3 down. So it just, like you said, it's driven, but you have to have answers on the perimeter when your 3 best teams in your schedule are USC, Ohio State, and Clemson in no particular order. And then your secondary opponents are Duke and Louisville and NC State. I mean, the only team that you could argue maybe you might need to be more of a traditional alignment for that's one of your top opponents is
Pittsburgh, right.
That's really it. And so that's part of it too. And so you have to get through your schedule before you can worry about how we match up against Georgia. But I think the multiple piece – go ahead, Tim.
A final point on this for me is I think Al Golden made a good point when he said we put in a lot last spring and last fall. This spring is weeding out what we don't need. We're making it schedule specific this year. To your point about what you need, that is a year 2 growth in a staff too. You put in everything you believe in. We don't end up using whatever percentage of it. Let's not put that stuff in. We're not going to use that stuff. That was an interesting point I thought he made at the end of spring.
And that's that NFL versus college football adjustment. Because college football,
you want to put everything in, but you couldn't use it all
because they had no base slap. They had no foundation and here's partly why their red zone defense sucked. It's partly why, and here's partly why they couldn't make big stops in big games because people say, well, you didn't lose to Stanford because of your defense. You didn't lose to Ohio State because of your defense. And I'm like, well, that's true, but they had late leads in both of those games, late third, and especially Stanford, where your offense, as bad as it was, gave you a fourth quarter lead. Marshall, your offense gave you, as bad as it was, gave you a fourth quarter lead, and then you proceeded to immediately give it back against Stanford. And then in 2 series, you had them backed up. Your offense and special teams pinned them inside the 10. It's 3rd 9, your own 9. All you got to do is play a slide route, an under slide. Well, just recognize it, and they're punting from their own end zone, and you probably go put that game away. And the reason they couldn't make stops in big games and in the red zone, Tim, is because they had no foundation. There was nothing they could hang their hat on. Where this offense, say what you want about it, when they needed a yard, you knew it was coming. They're going to go 12 or 13 person. They're going to run duo. That's just if you can stop it, great. If you can't, whatever. This team had nothing to hang their hat on, and that the only way you can do that is if we got to cut some of the stuff out and make sure that we know what we can hang our hat on. I still don't know if they have established a base. But I think they've at least cut down on some of the volume of stuff, and I think that's a positive. Now they got to figure out, well, what is our bread and butter? When we need a call on 3rd and 5 against Ohio State, what is the thing that I know that these kids can execute at an elite level and then call it? And I don't know that they've established that, but I feel a lot better about that potentially happening now than I did a year ago when he was talking about how we put everything in the spring. I'm thinking, really? 15 practices, you got everything in? Okay, we'll see how that turns out, and looked okay for a half of the first game. And then, you because you didn't have anything you could turn to in the fourth quarter, say, what's that call to say, hey, we got to stop the bleeding? What's that call you make to stop the bleeding? And they couldn't do it.
It was a double safety blitz, remember?
Oh, God. Hey, there's no way they're going to recognize after this timeout, this injury timeout, that the guy that's been doing a great job coverage all game is out, and we put a freshman in there. So let's do a double safety blitz and leave that kid on an island. Okay, that's great. This is kind of along those lines, Tim. Here's a question from Irish Blooded. He says, would you rather see Notre Dame play to the opponent's weakness or play to their strength regardless of the opponent?
It's a great question, except if you watch the Clemson game last year, you come away thinking to yourself, holy cow, playing to your strength, right into the strength and teeth of that opponent. Look, I picked Notre Dame to beat Clemson last year on our podcast. I did not think they're going to beat them in that manner, the way they beat Clemson, where it was just taking it to the opponent's strength. You have to be able to play to the opponent's weakness. You have to attack a weakness because Notre Dame has lost plenty of games when opponents have attack their weakness. But 75%, 80% of the game is your strength. Doesn't matter what the other team does in most cases, and go attack it. When you see a weakness, you have to absolutely attack with impunity. But other than that, I think part of it is you're playing football at an elite level. Keep playing football at an elite level, and then take your shots. If you have when Trevor Lawrence looked over and saw Julian Love out, and I'm not. This isn't even a thing against Dante Vaughn. It's Julian Love's out, and he looked over. And he's probably like, all right, well,
I'm taking
I
this
don't know what the
shot.
call is here, but I know what it's going to be on the next play, and that is attacking a weakness, but playing to the strength. He also played to his strength. Trevor Lawrence's strength is what he did on that play too. Play to the strength is my thing, and boy, did the Clemson point hammer it home for me last year.
The answer to me is yes. And what I mean by that is this. You got to play to your strengths every game. And if you're not doing this coaching thing correctly.
You're probably
But
not
you
good
got to
enough
play to your
to not play to your
Say
strengths
that?
as a college team.
Say it again.
How are you good enough to not play to your strengths in this sport too?
Right.
That's another way.
But everybody does. I mean, even
Yeah.
if you look at the LSU 19 team, what was their strengths? They played to those. And you had a very accurate quarterback, big time dynamic, big receivers. They played to that. Now, when you're talking about your specific aspect of your game plan, there's two things that you look at when you're putting a game plan together. Number one is, and this is what I would always do when I was a pass game coordinator, this is what we would do on the best teams that I played on. You go to and say, hey, look, here's who we are. We are an inside-outside zone team. Our two best players are this guy and this guy. We got to make sure that our game plan is worked around this. Now, how are we going to run inside-outside zone this week? Well, we think we can do this, this, and this to gain some leverage or numbers advantages. Because one of the things that I think is a little bit of a misconception when you look at the Clemson game is that Notre Dame just ran their strengths right at Clemson's strengths. And I'd say, well, not really. Because one of the weaknesses of last year's Clemson team on defense is they did not handle motions and shifts very well. They just relied on, we're better than you. We're just going to line up and be better than you. Brent Venables was very much I'm going to come from all angles. And all. The guy last year was just like, we're going to line up and we're better than you. And what Tommy Rees did a masterful job of in that game is, yes, they ran their strength. Big picture, Notre Dame played to their strength. We are a power running team. But the motions and shifts that they did that whole game allowed Notre Dame to out-leverage Clemson the entire game. We never saw Notre Dame bouncing duos the way that they did in that game and other games. And it was because they would line a tight end on one side, and then they would motion a receiver around and have him lead outside. And they were just following the receiver. They were following the receiver. That's maybe why, I don't know, why some people think that Jaden Thomas is a tight end or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I think they did. They had faith in Jaden Thomas at that point. They probably didn't have in week 2, 3, 4 range that really developed.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so what it allowed you to do is we are going to play to our strength, and we're going to play to their weak. We're going to use our strength to attack their weakness. And I think the perception is that, well, no, you ran right at their strength, and you did big picture wise because great defensive line, great linebackers, but you found a weakness in their scheme that you were able to exploit. And that's what I mean by both. Now, personnel-wise, you're going to play to their weaknesses as well. They got 3 great defensive linemen, but that weak side end is a guy that we can dominate. So we're going to do things to take advantage of that. Clemson did a great job of that, I thought, in the 2020 title game. Is they found weaknesses in Clark Lee's coverage structure that they were able to attack down the field. And so that's how they were able to get the big play to who was that had that big play in the slot? Was it Amari Rodgers? Was he the one that beat Sean Crawford on that big play that really sparked that Clemson?
Oh, yeah. You mean in the 2020 ACC
title game.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, it was Amari Rodgers, yeah.
And so that's what you do is you play to your strengths, but then you attack your opponent's weaknesses with your strengths. That's what good teams do. How can I get my best receiver in ISOs against the weaknesses of their coverage structure or their weaknesses of their secondary? I think that's part of it. But if you're not doing that around your strength, I don't know what you're doing. And I think that's something that
it was around their strength, to your point, because Trevor Lawrence throwing downfield, looking off Kyle Hamilton and attacking Notre Dame is part of their strength.
And they knew that if they lined up this way and had, I forget who the receiver was, but if you're looking here, you knew that Kyle Hamilton was immediately going to go right there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just what you knew. You watched film because that's what the coverage structure was. And then they're not going to come back and bang a backside post. It's just not kind of who they were. And they found that weakness and they went to it for a big play. And that's one of those ones you have in your back pocket. Like when we need a big play, we've got this in our back pocket. I talked to Chip Long about this one time, and I was like, you remember the wheel route they ran against Arizona State ran against Notre Dame in 14? Was it 14? Yeah, 14. He said, we knew we had that play the whole game. We just didn't know when we were going to use it.
Right.
When you're up 34-3, you don't need to use it. Notre Dame had just scored to make it 34-31. We got to pull it out now. And they went right to it and big play. And you got Sheldon Day running with a wheel route because they knew based on how they could motion and shift and line up that they could get Notre Dame in that matchup where, you're going to have a defensive lineman running with the running back on a wheel route. And they were just waiting on it. And that's part of it too. But they found a weak – Sheldon Day is not a weakness of the Notre Dame team, but when he's trying to run in coverage, he is. And that's what good teams do as well.
I think it's like Sampson's point. Weren't the three of us talking at a practice when he said Reggie Bush motioned out and Derek Curry went with him? And he just thought, this is a problem right here. Derek Curry's a good player, but this is a problem.
And then we started going through all the different moments, like, when did you line up and know this is about to be a touchdown?
Robert Woods.
We talked against Low Wood in 2011?
A lot of strength and a weekness going on.
Yeah.
In those
like, this is going to be good. This is not going to be good. But that's what good teams do, right? And that's like when Ohio State, when you see Tariq Bracy out, he's been giving you problems all game. What do? You go right at him. And then this is what frustrated me about against Georgia in 2019 is they were already playing the game without the one corner was already out. Tyson Campbell, I believe, was already out. Yeah. And then Eric Stokes gets knocked out by Liam Eichenberg at the end of the first series. And it wasn't until late second quarter and then again in the fourth quarter before Notre Dame actually went at him. Yeah. You got Chase Claypool, and you never took him. And when they did go at him in the second quarter, it was with Lawrence Keys. Now, Lawrence made a great play, and Ian made a great throw. But it's just one of those things where you're not playing to your strengths or attacking their weaknesses, in my opinion. And I think that's been something that's been lacking from Notre Dame at times over the years. So here's an important question. Ryan Roberts asked, what did Brian buy you for dinner when you won the bet in 2019? Actually, we just settled up on it last week.
We just had lunch. So I don't know, Brian, what are you buying for dinner when I win that?
Well, that was the bet. So I did pay off the bet then. So lunch, what did you have? We had wings.
You did make
right? We went to wings, etc.
You're going to have this year will be a dinner bet. That's good. There'll be more.
Yeah. We've had too many ties.
I feel like there was another tie, but it was during COVID, so there was no way of getting a lunch bet or something like that.
I don't go anywhere.
We'd have to cut dial in. Yeah.
All right, here we go. Here's a good one. Facilitate, inform. What are Sam Hartman's weaknesses that he needs to work on?
This is tough because Hartman, when you look at the numbers, he does put the ball in jeopardy, but I feel like he had interception numbers I'm talking about. I think that was part of what Wake Forest offense needed to do to win. If you're throwing the ball downfield, attacking one-on-one matchups, you're going to have more picks, 3 or 4 more over the course of a year than if your quarterback is super careful. And Notre Dame has had some very careful quarterbacks, or they have protected their quarterbacks too. So Hartman, I think Notre Dame thrives if he throws 10 picks this year. Whereas if Drew Pine throws 10 picks, 11 picks, you don't overcome that at all.
No, you're getting blown out.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're getting blown out. If it's a good team anyway, you're getting blown out. I think another thing too is to that, Tim. You're correct. Some of the turnovers need to. It's not the number; it's the type.
Right. The downfield ones are different. It's just you've attacked, you got picked off. It's different.
And there were times last year at Wake, especially 2 years ago. At times last year, but more so 2 years ago, where it's like, dude, you're trying to fit that ball into 3 guys. There's no need for it. It's 1st and 10.
Yeah.
There's no need for it.
The wrong type. That is definitely the wrong type of turnover.
Yeah. But at the same time, you got to say, well, you got to live with that because he's also going to fit one in there on 3rd and 5 with the game on the line, and you know, and that's the balance that Notre Dame needs to have is how do you clean up, So like if he throws 14 picks, what was it 2 years ago through 14, last year through 12? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, it's 2 years ago. 2 years ago was more.
So he had 38 and 12. That's when you consider the fact that he threw well over 400 passes. I mean, the guy's thrown over 900 passes the last 2 years. It's a pretty good, like, it's not a real high touchdown or interception rate. And then you look at the touchdown rate and it's 38 to 12, 39 to 14. It's a very high touchdown interception ratio. You got to live with some of that in order to get the high. Because what I felt Notre Dame did was they would kind of, in the past, is they would be so turnover centered, like you just can't do it, that the quarterbacks were averse to trying to make plays. I think that's something that crippled Ian Book. He wasn't a great processor anyway. I've never felt Ian Book read defenses very well. But when you then throw in the whole, like I said this in 2020, I loved how Ian Book came out against Duke, taking chances, making throws. The minute he threw that pick where he sailed that crossing route, he just completely shut down and just went back to being what he was the year before. And it's just like he was so afraid. And then, of course, the Louisville game, and just like he just unwilling to make plays. You have to balance that as a coach You have to be willing to live with some turnovers from your quarterback, as long as they're not stupid or crucial moments. That's the big thing.
I would demand a little less this year because you have the running game to lean on too. You don't, as you said, you don't have to fit it in there on 1st and 10 every time.
How long does it take Sam Hartman to mentally accept the fact he doesn't have to be that? That's a big question that is going to be answered this year.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see how that goes. And like we're like, you know what? I don't have to do this all by myself. Because again, this isn't Wake Forest. You're not going to go score 34, 52, and 55 points in 3 straight games against North Carolina and lose here. You're not going to do that here.
Hopefully, on 250 yards rushing against NC State, he realized, like, man, hand the ball off works pretty well right here. This is pretty simple.
Yeah, I don't have to make this play. Let me take the check down, because I know if I can get us into 3rd and 1, we're going to move the chains. I don't have to go make that play. That's going to be an interesting part of this, Tim, is going to be how he mentally handles this aspect of it. Kyle Wade says, a lot of people ask you and how you and Vince met, BD. How did you and Tim meet? It's very similar to me and Vince. It was in the press box. It was just
I was going to say
football in the press box.
2010, probably?
That was my first year, yeah.
Okay, the 2010.
Yep. So you were at Scout at the time. You were at Irish. What was it called? Irish Eyes.
Irish
That's
Eyes.
right.
Yep.
That's right. Yeah. So Tim has been my dude for a long time. So
Brian left in 2012, and Notre Dame went to the national championship game.
I know. Yep. I know. And in fairness, they also lost to like Pitt the next year when I also wasn't there. So my powers only last for a year. Yeah, they only last for a year. And I'm not even mad about the title game, Tim. I'm more mad that I didn't get to go to Norman. That's what I'm a little bit even more mad about. And I would have had somebody else pay me to go to Ireland. Whereas now, if I want to go to Ireland, I got to buy it myself. One of the downfalls of being a business owner. It's like, what? I don't have a company paying for me now? Dang it. Okay, here we go. I'm going to go to this one here from Irish Trending. What is your current confidence level for landing Elijah Rushing and Justin Scott? What are the odds we land both? So I think he means the first one as individually, and then the odds we land both. The odds that they get both are very slim.
I think so too. I have more confidence in Scott.
I hope you're right.
I know. I hope I'm right too.
I have a little bit more confidence right now in landing Elijah Rushing, which is not great when you consider I think they got a shot with Rushing, but I'm not ready to say that they're going to. I mean, they're not his leader, but I don't know that there's a school that right now is trending for him like Miami is for Justin Scott. That's the only difference for me. So right now, if I had to predict, I would predict they get neither of them as of today. But by signing day, we'll see. We'll see if it changes or not. What are your thoughts on that, Tim? You feel like you have something you want to.
I know. I feel I don't have incredibly high feelings for Scott, but I don't know if he's from what I'm told, if he's that badly of a Miami focused lean right now. But when you say both are, here's the awful thing we often do at Irish Illustrated's podcast. What's more likely, both or none? I agree with you.
I don't think I go there.
One, both or none's not fun. Both or none is not a fun game. That is not a great game to play.
No, it's not. You're
never allowed to say. You're never allowed to say one. That's the point of both or none. You're never allowed to
forget that.
One.
That's no fun.
Yeah.
It's when people ask me, which game would you rather lose? I'm not answering that question. I don't want to lose either one of those games. None of them. All right. Nathan Milton asks, which Notre Dame coach, except minus Marcus Freeman, do you think will be the most recognized after this season for their success on the field?
That's a good question. I'm going to go with Rudolph or Jared Parker.
I'm going to go with Jared Parker.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm going to go with him is because I think there's less expectations for him, and I think because of
expectations.
I think if Rudolph has success, you're going to have some people saying, well, he had that success because Coach Easton laid the foundation.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
fair or not, that's what some will say. Well, you inherited 2 great tackles and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the expectations for Rudolph are very high, but I think right now, because Parker's such an unknown, that if Rudolph has success, you're like, well, yeah, it's what you're supposed to do as the O-line coach in Notre Dame. Duh. Where if Notre Dame goes out there and scores 38, 39 points a game, or what the equivalent of that will be in this year's season, where the running clock and those type of things more. I mean, maybe 36 is the new 30. I mean, it's the new 39 or new 40 or something. I don't know. But basically, your top 10 scoring offense. I think Parker's going to be the buzz, much the way that Chip Long was in 2017. Remember that? I mean, Chip was like, "Oh, he may be the next head coach." It's like
Miami.
He's been here. He's 35. He's been here 1 year, but because the expectations were so low for that football team in 27, and the way that they went out and did it, it's like, okay, he's your new guy. And then in 2018, Clark Lee became that guy because of how good the defense was. So I think because the expectations are for Jared Parker are just sort of like, I don't know what he's going to do. I'm cautiously optimistic, Tim, personally, but it's a guess. It's a projection.
Yeah.
If this offense is what we think it's going to be, then all of a sudden, magazine, Jared Parker might be the next head coach from because that's just how it goes. I mean, Garrett Riley's never been a full-time OC by himself, and people are already talking about, well, what team's he going to take over if they do well at Clemson this year? And you're like, pump the brakes a little bit on this one, but that's where
I guess you're right in that if Joe Rudolph's offensive line struggles at all, it is automatically shifted to him because they quote unquote have the players. So that's he's on
right.
It's not a hot seat because I would like to be on a hot seat with an All-American, a potential All-American, and a fifth-year senior and all that.
I agree.
But
and I feel if the defense does really well this year, same thing with Al Golden, it'll be like, well, yeah, this is what you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you're supposed to do. I think the other coach who could potentially be recognized a lot after the season, if Notre Dame is a playoff team, it goes back to a comment you made earlier. Al Washington is very much been a whipping boy for Notre Dame fans, and in some ways, justifiably, when you look at some of the recruiting misses and the way the season last year went, et cetera, et cetera. I liked what he did this spring. I liked how his unit played together, the work, the things that they did in practices. If this is a playoff team, it's to your point, Tim, the D-line takes a big step up. And I think now all of a sudden, and to the previous question, if he can win one of those big recruiting battles, just give me one of those two. Give me Scott or rushing, and then have the D-line play to their potential. And all of a sudden, Al Washington goes from, the guy that's getting all the heat, right? Sometimes justifiably, sometimes you're like, well, where's the D coordinator in all this conversation, right? To a guy that people are like, oh, wow, Elston who and all. I mean, that's just kind of how it goes with fans, right? Yeah. And also justifiably because the talent on the D-line is not such that it's just get out of their way and let them go play. They have to be developed.
People would say there would be a lot written about Al Washington's defensive line if they're playoff caliber and Notre Dame exits the Clemson game with one total loss.
Yeah.
And they leave Death Valley with the win. That's probably, here's that dumb thing. What do you want to lose? I don't want that to be the first. I don't want that to be the loss. I want that to be another big win.
Yeah.
Because it's human nature that it propels you more so than your number 2 undefeated going into Clemson and lose. It's not that easy to get back. Your number 6 going into Clemson and win.
Clemson was able to get away with that in 16. With the late loss to Pitt, but that's because of what they were, the reputation they had established from the year before. Yeah. Notre Dame doesn't have that.
So let's say Al Washington has a playoff caliber line, and after they beat Clemson, he brings in Scott. There you go. He gets recognized.
And should. Because, again, this is not just a don't screw it up situation.
No, it's
on the D-line. Development is needed. If Riley Mills and Jordan Botelho and all the guys we talked about are going to take that next step, it's because they got coached into playing to that level. You didn't just walk in and inherit an Isaiah Foskey and this veteran and that veteran who's already been coached and developed. You've got to do the developing. And so he would justifiably get a lot of that love, more so than Al Golden would get, in my opinion. So, yes, I think Al Washington could be that guy. And at this point, I don't know what Mike Mickens can do to get more love than he's already getting. So he's not in that conversation. I don't think Chris O'Leary is going to be that guy. I don't see the recruiting win.
Hard for him to be in this conversation, yeah.
And he doesn't have the talent to work with either. That partly his own fault. He's been here long enough to where you should have at least a recruiting win or two that you didn't expect. But yeah, I think Al Washington could certainly be that guy. I hope that we are having that conversation, to be honest with you. Jancy Stuckey's another one. If the receivers that you talked about step up, he's going to become the new favorite because he's already doing. I was
going to say he's already pretty high on the favorite list for people though. And this is recognition, not grades. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Here's an interesting one, Tim, from Brendan Hallinan. Brendan asks, who do you trust more, the Notre Dame O-line against an elite D-line or Notre Dame's linebackers against an elite rushing attack.
I'm still with the Notre Dame O-line, even though I know if you take a 10-game history of them against elite D-lines, it's not great. The most recent one, obviously, was their best effort. I got to lean on the Alt Fisher, fifth-year senior Carell, love Schroth. Like that they will find something, even if it's 1A, 1B at right guard against an elite D-line. Now, don't tell me it's like Clemson's 2018 D-line or Georgia's 2021 front seven. That's different leaning on if you're just talking regular every day. I have a lot of faith in this offensive line.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they just whooped up on a team with no passing attack that had 2 first-round draft picks.
Yeah.
And another guy, KJ Henry, went round 4 or 5, something like that. So yeah, and a 3rd-round pick at linebacker, and another inside linebacker that people are talking about is a first-team All-American.
Yes, yep,
right. And they ripped them up. So that's I'm with you on that one as well. Salty Virginia Peanuts. I love one of my favorite names on here, Tim. Which game on the schedule is the most important? And you can interpret that as you like. And which is the trap game? The trap game, I think we already established that one, Tim. That's Duke.
Yes.
What about the game? What is the game that's most important? And you can take most important in any way that you like.
I'm going to take Ohio State because it sets the tone for the rest of the possible run. Beating Ohio State, if they beat NC State 30-13 and lose to Ohio State 30-28, everybody's going to look at it as just Notre Dame's the second tier team this year. It would be a harder uphill climb to lose after Ohio State. I don't think it's close. I know the timing on the schedule of Clemson is huge. But Ohio State, well, my timing for Clemson being the first loss would include beating Ohio State. So I think the Ohio State game is the most important game.
I think if you were going to make a whole, well, in order to get to Ohio State, you have to beat NC State first. Okay, that to me is not important. That's a tone setter. Is how I would explain that one. Because I know sometimes people say, well, that game doesn't matter if you're 2-2. Well, okay, fine, whatever. But if you are 2-2 and beat Ohio State, however, that completely changes the tone of your football season. Yeah. I mean, that's so I think Ohio State is the big one. And I think also, too, the part you nailed on that I think is important, Tim, is not even just what it means for your 23 football team, but just the statement that it makes for you nationally, the statement that you're sending to the country. The Oklahoma game in 2012 said more to college football than the Stanford game did. But I think the Stanford game was the most important game of that season. They were a better team
than Oklahoma.
Exactly. And that was the dragon you couldn't slay. Yeah. They had dominated you. The only people on that roster that had ever experienced a win over Stanford were the 5th-year seniors. That's it, if you think about it. Yeah. And most of those games weren't competitive. So that's, to me, Ohio State is a little bit of all of that, because you have played them twice in the last decade. They beat you convincingly once and showed in the second half they were the better team in the other, and beat you both times. You haven't beaten them since what, like the 40s or something absurd like that, because you haven't played them very often.
Yeah.
That's such a huge statement win to me that it not only defines your season, it sends your program in a completely different trajectory as a program, not as a team. Because Lou Samoji would always talk about there's a difference between a team and a program. And 2023 team, it's huge, but it's even bigger, in my opinion, for the program.
Well, if you think about it, they will have beaten in their last 5 home games, number 4 Clemson, destroyed someone on senior day that was enjoyable for Notre Dame fans because it was Boston College, even though they stink. 2 games that really don't matter, obviously, prior to Ohio State, but then Ohio State, number 3. Those will be the last 5 home games, will be Clemson, Ohio State, and Boston College. For a guy that started his home slates losing to Marshall, looking terrible against Cal, and losing to Stanford.
Boy, that was his first 3 home games, wasn't it?
Yes.
And then the next home game was against UNLV. That wasn't exactly any great shakes either.
You can't even take credit in that situation. Congratulations. You beat UNLV.
Great point.
Yeah. So that would change the tone too.
And a team that hadn't lost much at home in the previous 5 years.
Oh no, that's helped Brian Kelly revamp what he had going. They beat teams they should beat at home, and they beat Clemson one time at home.
Because they lost to Cincinnati in 21, but before that, wasn't the most recent home loss like back in 17?
It was Georgia.
Yeah.
Both of those are really good teams. I mean, Georgia was a great team, and Cincinnati was a playoff team.
Yeah. And everyone is saying, Tim, you passed the test. That is the answer. So
okay, yeah. Good.
Apparently to salty Virginia Peanuts, it was It was a trap for you, apparently, Tim, to make sure you got that.
I do not fall for trap games.
I would say the other trap game. I think if Duke is one, that's easy one. But I think to your point about Pitt's is one as well, because if you come out of that game because you get your bye week, you're feeling if you are a one loss or fewer team, you're focused on Pitt, but it's that big game down in South Carolina in a couple weeks. It's so I think that can be a bit of a trap game too. And I don't think Pitt's record is going to be phenomenal at that time, because like Duke could have a pretty good record at that time, but it's still Duke. I mean, they won't garner the respect from fans that they should. I was like, until I was blue in the face. Guys, Marshall's not a bad football team, but no one believed it before, and they still don't believe it now. It's just Notre Dame's terrible. It's like Tulsa in 2010. Tulsa was the worst loss. I'm like, that was not their worst loss of the season. Are you kidding me? That was one of the better teams they played that year.
Yeah, they had better skill position players, including quarterback at that situation than Notre Dame did in that game, because Floyd was hobbled a little bit. Tommy Rees had to come in. It is my crowning achievement of people hating me. I picked Tulsa.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, you got it right, so they shouldn't have on you. Well, and Charles Clay, I believe, spent a lot of years in the NFL. They're tight end. They're H-back tight end guy on that team.
They had DeMaurice Johnson. I'm going to get this wrong, but it was close to this. They had something like 3,700 yards receiving career from their three guys. And that's incredible at Tulsa. So anyway, there's your Tulsa moment we don't want to relive. Also,
isn't GJ Kinney? He's like an OC somewhere now, right? Yeah, isn't he? I believe he is. Yeah. So that was a good football team. Unfortunately, now again, not a team. We can say a team's good and still say Notre Dame had no business losing that game, right? And to me, that's how Marshall was. They had no business losing that game. There's no excuse for that game.
The Stanford game was worse because they're a bad football team.
They were terrible. Exactly. Marshall's at least good. Tulsa was at least good. Ryan just texted me, said GJ is actually a head coach now. Ryan, we're Incarnate Word. Okay, so he's actually a head coach now at Incarnate Word. So that's I always like seeing those former players that it's like Josh Heupel, still weird. Like he doesn't look anything now like he did. When he was
I know that is weird because that's a high level too. That's a little different.
Yeah. And here's a question from Jake Smith. He says, "What's your way too early prediction for the 4 spots in the playoff this year?" Appreciate you guys.
Georgia, because they're going to roll through a lot of it unless there's unless human nature just completely overtakes them some week, like at Auburn or something crazy like that. I mean, we've got to remember that is a huge rivalry for Georgia and Auburn, and it's at Auburn. Georgia's got to be one.
You're the champs until somebody beats you, Tim. I mean, that's the reality of it, right?
And they are better than the teams they're playing usually here too.
This is one. Now it's early yet. I'm
too early.
I'm gonna talk to let you think. Okay.
Yeah.
But the hard part about this is because of what we talked about earlier. There are no brainer surefire teams outside of Georgia, simply because, like in the Big Ten, you could say Ohio State and Michigan, but I'm like, okay, Ohio State's schedule is such they got to play at Michigan and at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And they're replacing their star quarterback. Michigan, they got to play Ohio State and then at Penn State. But then also, but I think Penn State could be a team that challenges in that conference this year. So I think a Big Ten team will make it. Obviously, I just don't know if it's a given that it's going to be Ohio State and Michigan or one of them. It could end up being Penn State because of how schedules shake out.
Do you think 2 SEC teams will make it this year? I kind of don't.
No, I think that this is going to be more than any other year, a year where the SEC eats itself a little bit. Not that they won't have teams deserving. The only way, in my opinion, that you have 2 SEC teams get in is if Georgia loses in the conference title game.
Right. And because if they're dominant number 1 all year long, they're going to probably still win.
And probably should. I mean, again, you could question their schedule, but let's just say, here's where it gets interesting, Tim. Let's just say, just to rile Notre Dame fans up for today, let's just say that that LSU goes 10-2 in the regular season. They lose to Florida State early in the opener. Then let's just say they get upset by Ole Miss on September 30th. They're 3-2. Then they beat Missouri on the road, Auburn, Bama. Army, beat Bama on the road. Then you beat Florida, Georgia State, Texas A&M at home. Can that kind of team be ranked high enough to where, as a 2-loss team, that a win over Georgia springs them into the top 4? Now, part of this is, well, what are the record of the other conference champs?
an
Right.
SEC West team that loses to, let's say, numbers 5 or 6 Florida State at the end of the year,
Yeah.
beats 2-loss Bama and beats 2-loss A&M and then beats Georgia, undefeated
Yeah.
Georgia, that team would get in, I think.
No, I don't think Bama's going to be a 2-loss team.
I'm just saying that, you know, you're going through
it would require, but somebody in the West, like, they're going to have like a big win over Arkansas. I think Arkansas is going to be a pretty decent team this year. Maybe Florida's better. Yeah. The only concern I'd have for LSU in this particular example is because they don't have a lot of great late season games outside of Bama, unless some team that they play is better than we think. Florida's better than we think, or A&M, because
A&M
Florida,
option.
Florida, Georgia State, and A&M at the end of the year. If those teams are as good as everyone says they're going to be this year, those are not great wins.
What if
but
Florida
you do have
State
that
is as good as everybody says they're going to be this year? Then that's your only 1-point loss or something along those lines.
Right. Bama is, to me, in a similar situation. Let's say they lose twice early. Let's say they lose at home to Texas, and then let's say they lose October 7th to A&M on the road. They'd have to beat Tennessee at home. They'd have to beat LSU at home. They're just not a lot of marquee wins. So that would get them close enough to where maybe a winner. I think if it's going to be a 2-loss team that gets in, I think it almost has to be Bama. I think they're the only ones that are going to get. I'm not saying it's correct. Exactly, Tim. The benefit of the doubt.
They get the benefit out there.
Yeah.
They're always on the cusp if they're a 2-loss team because and they will have a good win. I mean, they're gonna look great 8 weeks too. That's usually part of the.
Yeah, I mean, they'll have a huge November win over LSU, and then they'd have the win over Georgia. I don't think any other conference, because of the way that Penn State and Michigan are scheduling,
they lose. They're in some trouble. Yeah, Ohio State's tough because they're the one that plays Notre Dame. I mean, they have
Ohio State's interesting. They could be a 2-loss team that gets in if one of their 2 losses is not against Michigan.
Right, because you can't lose that last game in that situation.
Yeah, like let's say they lose to Notre Dame. Let's say that they lose to. The problem is there's just not enough really good teams on their schedule to really make you feel great about it.
I don't think they're a 2-loss team that gets in either.
You'd have a home loss to Penn State or a road loss. Yeah, that would be tough.
It might not be. Maybe this is a bad year for a 2-loss team.
Yeah.
Well, I think it is a bad year for a 2-loss team. So this is another bad year for a 2-loss team, I'd say.
Yeah. It'd have to be an SEC team. No Pac-12 team is going to have enough. I mean, y'all can say what you want, but reputation matters. It does. And to a degree should. I don't think a 2-loss Big 12 team gets in, even if it's Texas beating Bama and then losing twice.
They won't.
The only way that happens is if there's only 3 or fewer 1-0 loss teams. I think it's the only way that happens. Of anyone outside the SEC. It's going to be tough.
So far we have one playoff team.
Yeah. So, and who's that? Georgia?
Yeah, we agree.
But that's the thing, Tim. I don't know who's going to win the Big Ten this year. I mean, I can tell you it's going to be a Big Ten team. It's going to be an SEC team.
Pac-12.
I think a Pac-12. I do think a Pac-12 team breaks free. I just don't think it's going to be USC. I think it's going to be Washington or Oregon, in my opinion. I think it's going to be one of those two. Big 12. I don't see a team in the Big 12 that's going to have less than 1 loss. I don't. I think the Big 12 is going to be very competitive this year.
So if FSU loses to LSU but sweeps all the way through, and they win the ACC championship game, they're in, probably.
Probably, yeah. I think it would be better for them, and I'd feel even better for them if one of their losses if their loss was not to LSU. Yeah, to me, if you
ACC loss, but they still win the championship game.
And the other thing is, the 2 toughest games they play, in my view, are both early enough to where you can They play LSU on September 3rd, and then Clemson on September 23rd. So let's say they beat LSU but lose to Clemson. And then they've got Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Duke, at Wake, at Pitt, home against Miami, home against North Alabama, at Florida. Not going to be a lot of great wins in there, but they would rise because of just everyone else starts losing.
Yeah.
And then if Notre Dame –
quality loss.
Yeah, because there's no divisions in the ACC this year, right?
I'm going to put FSU in as my second playoff team in my way too early. I'm going to change this prediction by July right now.
So, Tim, is this the year they're going away from divisions in the ACC?
It is, I believe, yes. I don't think
so. Then to the Florida State point, if they lose to Clemson early, and then let's say they beat LSU and then lose to Clemson,
then they get to
because I think that's the ideal situation. If you lose to LSU but beat Clemson, you're not winning I just think rematches are really hard to win.
Right. Right.
So so the ideal scenario for Florida State is you get that big SEC win, then lose a road game to Clemson, and then win the rematch over Clemson and hope that they only, lost to Notre Dame or nobody else the rest of the way.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's the ticket for Florida State.
I'm going to change this, but my way too early playoff is Georgia, and I'm going to change everybody else. But Florida State is my guess right now because while we're going through these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think their losses are going to be early enough, and I don't see anyone in this unless they're just not the team I think they are. I don't see any losses after the bye week.
No, neither do I with that listing.
I really don't. So unless they lose to LSU and Clemson, now they could be that sneaky team that if Notre Dame beats Clemson and then they beat Clemson as well, if there is a bunch of chaos, they could be a team that has 2 losses that at least isn't an argument. Because who was the only 2-loss team that anyone's ever really argued for? Was it in 19 Georgia?
Well, Alabama too gets argued for. They didn't get in.
What year did
that was?
19.
It had to be 19.
I thought I remember a lot of people saying Georgia should have been the team that got in that year too. Was it what year? Was it 18 Georgia? That's who it was.
18 Georgia.
18 Georgia is the one that everybody thought had the argument to get in that year. Because 19 Georgia lost to 4-8 South Carolina.
Alabama had a very recent argument to get, not from me. I was screaming from the mountaintops they shouldn't get in whatever year they had 2 losses. I said this eliminates it just happened
this year.
Yes, that was it. That was it.
Yeah. And they didn't belong in this year either.
No.
But it's that benefit of the doubt thing with Bama that people are going to give. Boy, this is going to so Georgia, Florida State. I'm going to cheat and say a Big Ten team.
Yep, there you go. That's good.
I mean, a Big Ten team's going to get in, and then Notre Dame. That's. I mean, we're going to go to stealing. We're going to have some fun. So that's it. No take backs. No changes.
Let's not play Georgia in the first round. All right, yes. Let's play one of those other teams.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that'll be fun. All right. This is one of our, speaking of Ohio State, this is in the Big Ten. This is one of our Ohio State fans that's always in our chat. He's got a couple here, Tim. Notre Dame has the 4th most appearances in number 1 in the AP poll, 98 times. When is the next time they're ranked number 1 in the AP? OU is 3rd with 101 appearances. Will Notre Dame pass them in the next 5 years? I don't see Oklahoma spending a whole lot of time at number 1 when they go to the SEC.
Well, if Notre Dame beats Ohio State, they can hang on for 3 weeks for sure. I just got to avoid the upset. Sure. So there's 2.
Sure.
I think they will pass OU in the next 3 years, or in the next 5 years.
Yes.
The next time they get in, though, has to be September 25th poll. And
that's assuming Georgia has a loss. I mean, and they could go undefeated this year, Tim, and not spend a week at number 1 if Georgia.
I read this wrong. I read this as top 5 AP poll.
No. They've appearance at number 1.
Notre Dame will not have a number 1 appearance in an AP poll this year because Georgia will go all the way through without a loss against their schedule, is my opinion.
It would have to happen. Georgia would have to get upset by somebody that I'm looking at it now, like UT Martin, Ball State, South Carolina, UAB, at Auburn, Kentucky, at Vandy, Florida, Missouri, Ole Miss, at Tennessee. I mean,
Notre Dame, Tennessee, and Auburn are the 2.
The Auburn one will be interesting.
They will not spend a week. I think Georgia's schedule is not even as good as it usually is. That's hard to get number 1 this year.
Now, will they pass OU in the next 5 years? Yes, absolutely.
I think they can pass OU in the next 5 years.
No question. I mean,
but it's got to be the next 4 years because they can't get it this year in the regular season.
I don't now. I'm not going to go there because that's too pie in the sky. So we'll have that conversation if it gets to that. Archer also says NBC moved Michigan State and Penn State to Black Friday, and the game will be at Ford Field instead of Spartan Stadium, so it can be a night game. How much power will TV companies have over the future of the game? Already wielding it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's pretty clear. It's this point. Too much.
Way too much.
Yeah, way too much.
I mean, they control college football right now, Tim.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a playoff because of TV. We're heading towards 2 mega conferences because of TV. We're literally changing the rules of how the game is played because of TV.
Some of those rules are good to change, except they're not doing the ones where you need to change to just because it would upset television.
Right.
There'll be plenty of power over the future of the game.
I mean, they are wielding 95% of the power in college football right now, in my opinion. Yeah. I mean, this whole thing with the whole Big Ten not playing night games in November thing, that's all about TV. That's
right.
That's all it's about. It's about TV. Rankings, you don't I mean, almost everything that we see happening in college football right now is dictated by what's going to make for a better television product. I mean,
oh yeah.
So yeah, they wield way too much. Matt Radke says, "What are Tim's thoughts on Tommy Rees calling the passing play in the Gator Bowl inside the 10 when Buckner threw the 100-yard pick six?"
All right, I had a problem with it for multiple reasons. One is the logical one that you had them broken and gasping, and Audric Estime hammering the ball 3 times would have scored on the first 2. My other issue is that was not Sam Hartman or Jimmy Clausen at quarterback. It was a kid that battled back and has one really major flaw in his game. 2 major flaws in his game. He can be inaccurate and he puts the ball in jeopardy. There was no reason to put the ball in jeopardy there. So if you had, if you have a better quarterback, I still would have handed the ball to Audric Estime because you had them broken and had broken their will. But
or
I cannot.
If you want to put the ball in Tyler Buckner's hands, have it be on a run.
Exactly. Run. He has a 1-pass option running to the corner while he's on the right side. I'm with you on that one. But no, I was pretty shocked. I think I had to change my game story a little bit too, so that wasn't fun.
Yeah, I mean, the reason, like, look, I understood the call.
Yeah,
I didn't like it.
You're not using Tyler Buckner properly here, and he's the
guy
over
the middle of the field. Where were both of his interceptions in that game, Tim? Right over the middle of the field.
Really weird.
Yeah, I got it. I didn't like it, but it's also one of those things where I think the point you made, Tim, is run it down their freaking throat. And if they stop you on 4 downs or 3 downs and you got to kick a field goal, you just took 2 minutes off the clock, or you force them to use all their timeouts in order to milk the clock. And then you nail an easy, cheap field goal, and now it's a 2-score game. And you've all the momentum is in your direction. You're about to run that team off the field. I think they punch it in, and all of a sudden it's 45-31, and South Carolina goes 3-and-out or turns it over in the next series, and then Notre Dame just rolls them late. That's what I think would have happened if they would not have done that. But I think if you wanted to throw the ball or you wanted to catch them there, then run some, like you said, a slide route. We got Mitchell Evans leading, or if Tyler keeps it, then he just turns up and blocks. They've been killing them with those misdirections with Chris Tyree going in motion, and they, run a counter, something backside, all that.
Yeah, you don't
run
have
to Estime,
but the fake to Estime, Buckner on the roll, is a fantastic situation for Buckner. That's Tyler Buckner to his strength too.
Yes. That's a great, that goes back to the original point I'm making. You're playing to your strength. Yeah. A drop back pass from Tyler Buckner in a condensed part of the field for an inaccurate quarterback who had already turned the ball over twice in that game was a bad call. It was a bad call. Siggy 13 asks, I was about to call you Vince. Tim, from the media side, what is the biggest differences between Freeman and his regime and Kelly?
Freeman is way more open to access to coaches and players. I think in his first spring, we talked to like 46 different players. It did not lessen this spring, I wouldn't think. We've gotten all the freshmen when they come in, early enrollees. You never used to do that. Shouldn't say never. Brian Kelly did do that in 2010, his first year, and then he completely stopped doing it after 2010. A lot of stuff happened in 2010, as you recall, though. I mean, that was crazy. But yeah.
If I was trotting out Charlie Molnar and Bob Diaco for interviews and the things that came out of their mouths,
I can't really hold him. Oh, yeah,
I can't blame him for that.
I used to give BK a total pass. I'm like, I don't blame him for not having those guys go out there anymore. But then he got some guys that really were engaging, and like you could only talk to Bob Elliott once a year. That was ridiculous. Like he was
Mike Elko, Chip Long.
Oh yeah, they're all wonderful.
Yeah. Clark Lee. Yeah.
The other way is, I think, and this was last year, and there was a little bit of excuse because they were playing Ohio State, but I think this is the case. I think Freeman will allow far less meaningful practice access than Brian Kelly did.
Yeah.
He used to really, I don't mind the no access after week 2 of camp or after day 11, but spring, I think there could be more access than there is now. And the first 2 weeks of camp, Kelly was really good with that. He had, like, I'm just use Culver's example, opening at Culver, full practice, closing at Culver, full practice, another viewing at some point, and a full practice, whatever the Saturday they would call like the end of camp. So you could kind of ask him questions. Who's the backup here? Who's all that? I liked that part of the media side with Kelly.
Well, and then the one year it was practice was open to like everyone. It was like remember the faculty and said, well, we'll let you in for that one. Well, it was smart. That's, it's
I think it's a good idea. Yeah.
I agree. I don't see them giving us that much access during fall camp. It'll look a lot like last year, which is like, what did we have? Like 3 last year? 3 practices last year in fall camp?
I mean,
it's 1 full.
Yeah, 1 full.
Yeah.
I think spring is very helpful to talk to all the coaches, though, because they do give you background on all the in August, I'd rather see the team practice a little bit more.
Yes. Agree.
I think in spring, coaches want to tell you stuff. In August, they inherently don't want to tell you stuff. And I get that. I understand that.
Yep. And you pretty much nailed how coaches are. There's no question. Got a couple more here, Ryan, Tim, before we get out of here. Irish Blooded asks, is chances that Tobias Merriweather has more yards, but Greathouse has more TDs?
One prediction. I think the first prediction on Irish Illustrated was that Merriweather will lead the defense, or lead the defense. That'd be rough. Will lead the offense in receiving yards. I have not made the TD reception yet because Merriweather, I think, will have more yards than any receiver. I think Jaden Thomas, I keep saying that because everybody else, Jaden Thomas will have the most snaps of all the wide receivers when you add them up at the end of the year.
Because he's going to play all 3 spots.
And I loved Greathouse's film. I loved Greathouse in the Blue Gold game. I love watching Greathouse play. I think he's also more of a downfield threat than he's getting credit for because he was carving up things underneath. But it is so hard to say that the freshman's going to have more TDs than the other guys.
Even the double whammy, Tim, is that he's a slot. And the slot's not necessarily a high touchdown position.
I think Greathouse will have huge impact on games as a freshman, moving the chains and having a good year. But I don't think he will end up having more of of catches, yards, or touchdowns than the leaders on the team.
To me, there are only 2 potential options at receiver for most touchdown catches, unless it's like the leader has like 4 and they're just spread out.
Right.
So like Jaden Thomas gets 4, something like that. But if it's going to be someone that's going to lead the team with more than 6, let's say that. If the leader has more than 6, it's only 2 options. It's Tobias Merriweather or Deion Colsey. And I say Deion Colsey simply because of the position he plays if Deion figures it out.
Yeah.
The W is going to get a lot of red zone 30-yard in touchdown opportunities. And Deion's the kind of player, and this is what's so frustrating about Deion because he's got so much potential. He's 6'5", but he's fast. I mean, you remember the practice we were at where he just smoked Benjamin Morrison, but then he drops the ball in the end zone, right?
He's got to put it together though. Like Merriweather
position, yes. But
I would bet
if you look at Sam Hartman too, Sam Hartman loves throwing those boundary go routes. Go back and watch him against Clemson. He was hitting those boundary go routes all game long and just dropping dimes. So if Deion's the guy we hope he can be, he's got to show it. It'll be him. If it's not him, I would bet on Tobias.
I would bet heavily on
Jaden Jaden's my third option. Jaden Thomas because Jaden could have a couple outside, a couple inside, but I just don't think Jaden's a big enough downfield, like 50-yard touchdown option for me. So that's my only drawback. But I don't think it'll be a tight end this year. I don't.
No, in fact, that's why if you wanted to say Greathouse could get 5, I think that Greathouse could get 5 because I don't think it'll be a tight end this year. I think the tight end Mitch Levens could have 3.
And then Stace has 2 or 3. Eli Raridan has 1 or 2 late.
Comes back and gets a couple when he's back.
Yeah. Here's a prediction I'm going to have. Davis Sherwood's going to score a touchdown this year. Watch.
So will Salerno.
Well, Sam, but Salerno scored last year.
Yeah, but I'm saying he is Salerno. Priester's really on this one, but I think Hartman will early in the season have a little bit of a security there while the other Jaden Greathouse non-freshmen work their way in as the season. Like I think Flores can have a better year as it goes along.
Mm-hmm.
I think he will trust Salerno coming out of practice. I don't mean he's a starter or that. I'm just saying he's going to get a touchdown in those first 3 games.
Oh, he could get a touchdown, sure.
There you go.
I think
I'm 1 touchdown, not like 5.
I think that you're going to see in a big game, they're going to go in their 13 personnel stuff, and Davis Sherwood is going to leak out and catch a big play.
Yeah.
Catch a touchdown. And big play, it could be a 50-yarder, but I'm more thinking like a 15. But it could potentially be like remember the wheel route they ran out of that to Brock Wright against Bowling Green in 19, something like that, where I could see Davis Sherwood finding himself wide open for a touchdown in a key moment. Kind of, the Mitchell Evans, you think of the Mitchell Evans team against South Carolina, something like that, because you're just, when he's on the field, you're not thinking about it. This is their lead blocker, and with Sam Hartman, I think we're going to see the combination of Sam Hartman. I think Jared, one thing I think I can comfortably predict about Jared Parker is he's going to be a little bit more aggressive with the pass game than what we've seen in past years.
Yeah.
For a host of reasons, not even just because I think he's inherently aggressive, but also he's got Sam Hartman to throw those passes as opposed to, Jack Cohn, who love Jack Cohn, but you're not going to come, hey, just throw a million bombs, although they kind of did in the first game with Jack Cohn, then went away from it after the Florida State game, but because they couldn't protect him. But I think we'll see him take more chances with stuff because that's kind of also partly playing to your strengths of Sam Hartman, who's got a little gunslinger in him. Yeah. Nathan Milton asks, if you were Notre Dame, what concessions would you make to sign Justin Scott that you don't do for anyone else? My answer to that is none.
Yeah, I'm not in that realm as much either. I make more concessions for a All-American junior or senior coming in.
You're talking about a transfer?
A transfer.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes. Agree with that. Let me ask you this one, Tim. This is a bit of a bigger picture college football one. This is from Irish for Life. He says, in 2015, the NLRB, I think that's the National Labor, it's the labor board, right?
Sure.
Has stepped around college athletes as employees. Now the most recent filing is only on the issue of student athletes as employees. What is your opinion on this?
This is difficult because if you're paying everyone a salary annually, which people are getting paid for showing up in addition to the scholarship, I eventually am going to be, I think they'll be viewed as employees. I think they can make money as employees. They can make different levels of compensation as employees, and they're all guaranteed money as employees. The only problem is you are also then able to fire employees at any point. And that's when it gets to the slippery slope of, look, obviously Notre Dame has to tell players you are not in our plans as a team member next year, but they are still allowed to be in the school. That's not firing the employee the same way you're going to get fired in a lot of places for that. So I believe once it happens, it's going to get even uglier in college football.
I don't think it'll ever happen. And the reason I say that is because I think once that happens in a state like California, which they're pushing for now, that's when you see that's when you're going to basically, the NCAA is going to go to Congress and say, you got to do something. Because essentially here, and it's a really, from a legal standpoint, it's interstate commerce. Because what one state is doing is creating an issue in other states. It's not just, hey, I'm a states' rights guy, right? If you want to talk about my political leanings, I'm a very big, I think the federal government has too much authority, but there are certain things that, that determine, well, this isn't just affecting you. This is affecting all these other things by the very nature of it. You can't have this state is setting these NIL rules to help their state schools. This state's setting their different. You can't have that. At some point in time, there needs to be some national thing. And the reality is the NCAA they don't have the stones, or because of some recent Supreme Court rulings that I'm not a fan of the lengths in which they went. And now the NCAA is completely afraid of being sued and no, I'm not a Republican, by the way. I'm not a Democrat either. So don't stop trying to, there's people on both sides that are states' rights people. But the point of it being, Tim, is you have to step in and say something has to be done. And there's all these people that think that they're pro player that want them to be employees that are to me making horrible arguments, because being employees to me would be the worst thing to happen to student athletes.
Oh, I've been saying for 4 years now, be very careful when you start getting paid in these situations, because you don't, then it just becomes bad business. It becomes bad business for the people in charge.
Right,
it is bad business now.
Because you won't have the guaranteed contract type of protection that the unions give, because that's the next step. You'll see then unionization, but it's going to be so much harder to unionize 65 to 130 plus teams than it is, and the ramifications it's going to have on Division I AA, Division II, Division III. It's going to be so challenging, and so you're going to have to see Congress step up, and that's some of the bills being proposed already are basically saying they can't be employees. That's going to happen. And California is gonna I think is gonna force that. I don't know that I'm gonna love the bills that Congress produces for this, but they have to do something to prevent the whole employee thing, because to me that is going to be the worst thing for student athletes. Any athlete that thinks they want to be an employee, you're nuts, and it's because you've never actually had a real job that you think you want to be an employee. because it's a different animal. So I actually don't think it'll pass in a state, but it'll never actually come to fruition, because I think that's when Congress at least steps in and says this. That's how I think it ends up not happening. But and when California does it, a couple other states are going to immediately follow suit. Illinois will immediately follow suit. Massachusetts will immediately follow suit. Some of the states that think like California about these things, because last time it happened, it came out of Illinois, right? That was with the Northwestern stuff, correct?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you'll see it again come out of there. They'll go back to that as well, because they're all trying to. Why do states want them to be employees? They want. Oh, these are employees in our state now. We want to take advantage of that, and that's basically what it comes down to at that point in time. Last couple, Tim, before we get out of here. Here's one from Brian Dembo. If you have more defensive questions than answers by Halloween, do you tell the Owls to warm up the resume?
More defensive questions than answers. Oof. I mean, that's pretty much. They wouldn't be the only people if you have more defensive questions than answers, right? That's who enters in good faith here. Mickens is highly viewed. Mm-hmm. See, I think Al Golden and Al Washington are going to end up. This is why this is a tough question to answer. I think the defensive line of the defense are going to have a much better year overall, consistently, than they did last year.
Even if Al Golden doesn't do any better,
that doesn't mean what's that?
Even if Al Golden doesn't necessarily do any better, if you're someone who thinks he didn't do a good job, just the nature of year 2 in that system, lot of guys coming back, inherently, they're going to be better than they were a year ago. Even if he doesn't necessarily do a better job, to your point. Please continue.
I know that we've had this discussion before when Ohio State was led by Urban Meyer, and those resumes got warmed up if they didn't win a national championship. So I guess it depends on what level of questions there are answers by Halloween. It's a good question, because there was no chance in year 1 that someone would be judged that harshly, especially by a first-year head coach. Nor do I think they should have been in year 1.
Unless they're disasters.
Yeah,
Brian Van Gorder should have been judged in year 1. Correct.
Yes.
Correct. I don't know if you guys get this on your board, Tim, but we would have people comparing Al Golden to Brian Van Gorder. I'm like, guys, we got to pump the brakes a little bit. I was frustrated by things I saw from the defense last year.
Sure.
This was still a top 30 defense. Brian Van Gorder's defense by the end of year 1 was not a top 100 defense. I mean, they don't deserve to be in the same conversation ever.
It's just
when it comes to
it was a frustration thing for people.
And I get that. I will say this: if the defense is struggling by Halloween, then I think you got to really think about, do we have the right people in charge of those 2 key positions?
Well, they certainly should not be 5-3 because they lost 40-38, 38-35, and 34-31.
Yeah. But what if they're even winning those games like that? I mean, now I'll say this: when is Halloween, Tim? Where is that on Notre Dame's schedule? Where's Halloween on Notre Dame's schedule? It would be. Let me. When is Halloween 2023? Let me look this up real quick. I'm trying to find out which game that will be. So Halloween 2023 looks like it says it's going to be October 31st. Okay, October 31st. So Notre Dame will be basically getting ready for Clemson at that point in time. So you'll be coming out of the pit game, right? It's that next Monday. So to me, if the questions are, will you beat USC and Ohio State, but you gave up 40 points each, as long as you're not also doing that against Duke and NC State and whatever, then I don't care. You won those games. You had to at least make enough stops to win the game.
Right.
That's going to happen. You're going to win shootouts. It just can't be happening consistently, which is what hurt Wake Forest. It's like, well, we won this one 41-38, but we lost that next one 42-38. If that's happening consistently, then that's a problem. If it's only happening in those 2 games against those 2 teams and you still go 1-1, I think it's more of just that's just the nature of college football. You're going to have shootouts. Everybody has them.
Yep.
Georgia gave up 41 points in the SEC title game on what I felt was the best team they had the last 2 years. It's going to happen when you're playing teams like that. It just can't also be happening against NC State and Duke and teams like that. That would be more of my issue, Tim, and where I would say, hey, I just don't think you have the right guys running this thing if you're struggling consistently. But if it's just, hey, we're still having a hard time stopping Ohio State and USC, well, you know who else is?
Right.
Everyone else, So I think there's only been one team that's been able to figure out the Ohio State problem, and that's Michigan.
Yeah.
Georgia hadn't figured it out. I mean, Clemson hasn't figured it out. They gave up like 52 the last time they played Ohio State. Michigan's the only one that's really been able to figure out in the regular season. And even then, it's not like Ohio State didn't score in those games. They just didn't score enough to help. You got to keep those teams into the 20s. If you can keep those teams to 30 or less, you got a shot to win those games, in my opinion. And you should win those games. If you're getting them in at close to 40, it's like, okay, now you're Oklahoma at this point in time. Because that's what made Oklahoma's defenses bad, Tim. It wasn't that they had bad games against the 2 or 3 best teams in the league. It's they would then go up and give up 38 to Iowa State when they were 5-7. You know what I mean? It's like, that's the problem. They're giving up points every week. If Notre Dame's shutting everybody else down, but Ohio State and USC are moving the ball, and you're able to make a couple stops, and you go 1-1 in those games, and you're 8-1 going into Clemson. All right, okay, that's what happens. So we'll see. We'll see how it plays out. Last question here from John Erickson. He says, a rephrasing of a previous question. What is the reason to believe the offense will not struggle to adjust to new coaches like the D appeared to last year?
I mean, I think that was one of the key components in the end result of the Parker hiring, is that he's not making major changes to this offense. He's going to put his own stamp on it, but I think he'll put even a bigger stamp on it as we move forward. I don't think there's going to be much of there won't be a major. It's going to look different with Sam Hartman at quarterback. But
it's not new plays.
The quarterback. It's not new plays.
It's a new emphasis of plays you already had, that you maybe didn't run as much.
Yes.
Right. Tim, I think too is really the only change on offense this year is Gino Guidugli and Joe Rudolph. The one thing that I hear a lot when I talk to sources around the program is Harry Hiestand and Joe Rudolph have very different personalities. Their teaching, the way they teach is different, not better, not worse, is different. But the core principles of what they emphasize are almost identical. I heard that during Joe Rudolph's interview. I heard that throughout the spring, and I heard that coming out of the spring, that the things that Harry Hiestand focused on and believed in are the exact same things that Joe Rudolph believes in. They just teach it differently. And again, I'm not saying one's better or worse. So I don't think there's going to be a huge change in the expectations and the focus of what the defense, like Jeff Quinn and Harry Hiestand had 2 completely different philosophies on offensive line play. Joe Rudolph and Harry Hiestand have almost identical philosophies on offensive line play. They just teach it differently. They may Joe Rudolph might like this run play more. He may be more of a pin and pull guy, where Harry is more of a zone guy, or whatever the case may be. But their philosophy on what's important on offensive line play, toughness, pad level, using your hands, technique, firing off the ball, working your feet through contact, getting the second level, keeping your hips square, all that stuff is going to be very similar. So I don't think there's going to be a huge change in that regard. And then Gino Guidugli, he's the quarterback's coach, and he's going to have a new quarterback. So, I mean, you're going to have a change there. Even if Tommy Reese is still the quarterback's coach, you're going to have a change because you have a brand new quarterback. So I don't think it matters a whole ton. I think this is going to be a lot more continuity for this offensive unit than it was a year ago, where you had the same OC, but everybody else was new.
I think it mattered a bunch in the spring at quarterback, because it was Sam Hartman starting off with a new quarterback's coach in March, as opposed to in January with Tommy Reese. I mean, he literally he couldn't hit the ground running in the spring. Everything was, there was just a different teaching level. Not teaching level in terms of Reese versus Guidugli, but it was just, I think that adjustment has happened.
Yeah.
And it's probably why we saw very limited practice, but it took a long time for us to see Sam Hartman look like Sam Hartman.
Yeah. We saw a play here, play there.
Right.
But yeah. And then I'm sure you heard the same thing. I heard he looked exact same way the week before in the spring, in the scrimmage,
big game,
that he looked great
in the jersey scrimmage. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that he played. It was very clear who the best quarterback was on that day.
I
heard Buckner played well too.
Kenny Minchie had a good day. Yeah,
yeah. But I was told it was very clear that Sam Hartman was that guy on that scrimmage, and that's who he's going to be to a degree. I mean, he's going to be that guy that, I don't care what he looks like on Tuesday. Let's see what happens on Saturday. And with a 6-year senior, honestly, Tim, I don't care as much about what he does on a Tuesday as I do with Tyler Buckner, who still has a lot of mechanical things that he's working through and reads and experience. So that's just the reality of it. That's going to do it, Tim, for today's show, man. I really appreciate you having you on. We'll have to have you back here again. We're going to have you. I'm going to really work on trying to get you back here as we get closer to the season, and we can actually sit down and have some fun with predictions. and do
We'll
some of
actually
those
give you
things.
more
So,
than 1.5 playoff teams.
that's
time.
right.
That'll be good.
And well, we gave you conferences. We gave you Big Ten, we gave you ACC and SEC. So hey, we gave some conferences. But hey, folks, before you get out of here, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. And if you don't know, Tim, why don't you let people know where they can find you? Obviously, Twitter, socials, and then and everywhere else.
Sure, irishillustrated.com and our podcast, Irish Illustrated Instant Analysis. Irish Illustrated Insider, Irish Illustrated Instant Analysis on all the post-game coverage, and of course, Tim O'Malley ND for Twitter. Stay off that Twitter stuff, though, guys. Stay off Irish Breakdown and ND Twitter. Twitter's a cesspool. Come follow us everywhere else.
It really is, man.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous.
No, actually, don't stay off it. Just calm down when you're on it.
Well, we have pretty good people here, and our folks engage on Twitter. It's usually the people that aren't here are the ones acting like that on Twitter. But everybody, before you leave, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. As always, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. You can check out all of our free content at irishbreakdown.com. Check out our merch store. You can find the link to it in the description box below. You can also find the link to our daily mailbag, or not daily mailbag, but our daily newsletter that we send out is also there. You'll see that in the link below as well. So, Tim, thanks for coming on. Everybody, thanks for being with us today. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you again soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.